Доброго дня, любі
Good
учасники.
morning, good afternoon, dear
Так,
participants.
уже до нас приєднуються
We see people joining,
наші всі учасники з всього регіону
all the participants
Східної
from
Європи,
the
Південно-Східної
entire
Європи та
region of Eastern Europe,
Центральної Азії.
Southeastern Europe, and Central
Наш
Asia.
вебінар перекладається на
Our
5 мов.
webinar is being
Як ви
interpreted
заходите,
into
будь ласка,
5
обирайте
languages. So when you
зразу
enter the
мову,
workshop,
якою ви
the
будете слухати наш
webinar,
вебінар.
please
Вебінар
choose your
перекладається
language channel.
грузинською,
We are
албанською,
interpreting into Georgian, Albanian,
сербсько-боснійсько-хорватською, українською і
Serbian, Bosnian,
російською, і англійською.
Croatian,
Тому вибирайте, будь ласка, мову,
Ukrainian,
яка
Russian,
вам
and English. So you can choose the
найближча.
language that
Це
is
останній
most
вебінар з
convenient for
нашої
you.
серії.
This
Можна
is the
говорити
last
цікавий вебінар
webinar
цього
of the
тижня.
series.
Всі
We
два
have had
вебінари,
2
які йдуть,
webinars
будуть
this week.
записані. Я вам
Those
в
previous
переписку в чат
webinars and this
скидувати
one,
посилання,
they are
де ці
going to be
вебінари будуть
recorded. I will send you the
зберігатися.
link
І також
to
сьогодні,
the
після завершення
repository
третього
for this
вебінару, ми
webinars, for these recordings. And
запустимо
after we
тестування.
complete the
Тільки
third
зберіться до
webinar,
запису,
we
там
will
буде кнопка
start
«Пройти тестування».
the
І
test
пройшовши це
and the
тестування,
same page
ви
where there will be
зможете ще раз
recordings, you will
закріпити
have the
свої
link
знання,
to the
ще
test.
раз
So
отримати
when you
ключову
pass the test,
інформацію
you will
з
be in
кожного
the position
вебінару,
to once
а також
again
отримати іменний сертифікат, який прийде вам на пошту. Це
recap the
тестування
knowledge
можна буде
and
пройти
also
до
receive
кінця
the name
січня
certificate that you will
2023
receive to
року.
your
Тобто у вас
mail.
є
And
півтора
you will
місяці, щоб
be in
пройти
the
тестування та
position to
отримати
complete the
сертифікат.
test till the end of January next year. So you will have 1.5
Все,
months
з
to do
технічних
that.
частин все. Я буду
All in all,
скидувати
that's
слайди, є
it.
запис.
And I
Чекаємо
will
ще всі
send
наші
you the link
учасники
where we
приєдналися.
store
І
the
тоді
recording.
передаю
We are
вас в руки
waiting
пані Марті.
for more participants
Пані
to
Марта,
join,
ввімкніть
but
мікрофон.
meanwhile, I pass the floor to Marta.
Вітаю, шановні колеги.
Welcome, dear
Дуже рада,
colleagues.
що ми
I'm so
сьогодні
happy
вже
that
втретє
today, for the third
зустрічаємося.
time, now we
Сьогодні
have
ми
this
будемо
meeting.
говорити про
And
те,
today we are going to speak
як ми можемо
about
допомагати, як ми
how
можемо
we could
підтримати
help,
постраждалих.
how we could support
Я
survivors.
почну,
And let me start now
представлю коротенько себе.
by introducing myself again
Видно
briefly.
мою презентацію?
Can you see my presentation now?
Так, видно. Супер.
Дякую.
Yes, we can see it.
Отже,
Great.
я
So
Пані Марта, вас не чути.
Marta, we don't hear you.
Я правильно розумію, у нас пані Марта відключилась,
So
правильно?
I understand that
пані
Marta
вже
was
відключилась.
disconnected. Yes,
Так, вона зараз
unfortunately, that's
повернеться.
what
Ми
has
просимо
happened.
вибачення
Okay,
за
she'll be back.
таку ситуацію.
And
В
sorry
Україні
for the
зараз
situation.
вибиває
Now
світло.
in Ukraine, we have
Я
this
теж
frequent
сиджу під
shutdowns.
фонариком,
I'm
під
also using
ліхтариком,
my
тому
flashlight.
я думаю, що пані Марта зараз
That is
буквально
why
через хвилинку
I do
повернеться.
believe that in a
Тим
minute or
часом, поки
so,
ми чекаємо
Marta
нашу
will be back.
спікерку,
Meanwhile,
давайте
while
поспілкуємось
meanwhile,
трошки в
while we
чаті,
are
хто у нас є в чаті.
waiting for the speaker, let's
Поділіться, будь ласка,
talk in the
враженнями, які
chat
були на
box.
попередніх
Can you
вебінарах, що
maybe share
найбільше
your impressions from the
запам'яталося, що
previous
найбільше вас
webinars?
вразило.
What you remember
Поки ви думаєте, розкажу свою історію, як
most,
ми
what
взагалі
has
вирішили
impressed
організовувати ці
you?
вебінари.
And let me
Я
explain
мала
how
вдачу
we
потрапити
arrived
на
at
живий
the
тренінг пані
idea
Марти.
to
І
organize these
коли її
webinars. I
прослухала,
was
коли
lucky
прослухала
enough
ті
to be at
теорії, ті
an
дослідження, про яких вона
offline
розповідала на
training
попередніх
by
вебінарах,
Marta. She
то
presented the
я
series
зрозуміла,
and the
що таку
surveys that
інформацію
she
повинен
presented at the
почути
webinar.
кожен.
So
Це дуже
there I
важлива
realized that
інформація,
this
і
information would be
це
important
потрібно
for
публікувати, не
everyone.
знаю, в газети
This is
друкувати, це потрібно
really
теж на
important. This
кожна
is what
жінка,
we
кожен
need to
чоловік.
publish on
Особливо вражають
newspapers. This
дослідження,
needs
так,
to
коли
be,
ми говоримо
we need to raise
літературі про
awareness of
попередні
every
дослідження.
man and
Так от,
woman, especially when it is
якщо
about
можна, напишіть, будь
surveys,
ласка, в чаті.
about
На
practical
жаль, ми не можемо
stuff,
надавати слово
not
піднятою
only
руки,
about
але
theories.
можете
So
написати в чаті ваші
unfortunately, we
враження, я їх
cannot
озвучу.
hear you, but you can write in the chat and I will try to read it aloud. Maybe some statements, some theories from the previous webinars that impressed you most. I see raised hands among participants, but unfortunately we cannot pass the floor to you. Technically, we have limited time and people say that the chat is inactivated. Oh, that's right. Now I ask technical support people to help us, but you can anyway use your Q&A insert. So you can use this function to answer the question. Any feedback, any impressions, or you're speaking about the difference between the care and support, about vertical and horizontal relationships. So the taking, supporting someone, it is where you offer something to the other and the other may say yes or no. But this kind of forced care, this is really when the other person has no choice. And you can ask questions about today's topic. Today we are going to discuss how we work with survivors, what to do when survivors come for your counseling session, or this may be a friend or acquaintance. So they may share that they suffer domestic violence or had an episode of sexual violence, how to act in those situations. So this is what we're going to discuss during today's webinar. While we have more comments, colleagues from Balkan countries, they say that you never have enough of these seminars. You never have enough information, and we need to speak more, to find out more, raise our awareness in order to efficiently counteract violence against women. I absolutely agree with you. This is not our last training. We will definitely invite speakers and organize webinars on these topics. Our colleague from Moldova indicates that it was interesting to find out the signs that make it possible to understand that a woman is in a situation of violence or there are high risks of violence. That's important when we can preemptively see the situation where we see some signs that most likely some violent episodes may happen in the future. And as Marta mentioned, and she will repeat that the best way to prevent violence is before the first slap, before the first act of physical violence. You need to implement interventions and work with psychologists to apply various practices. So most efficient way to do that, to prevent that, is before violence happens. And this is about preventive programs at schools for boys and girls, psychological trainings. And these are most effective before the first slap, before the first act of violence. More people agree that it was interesting to find out more about the signs of looming violence. For me personally, it was very interesting to hear about that honeymoon period, and that helped me to answer a lot of questions about why women who suffer violence often go back to the perpetrators. And the answer to this question is very much about that honeymoon, where the perpetrator and the survivor come to peace, and it seems that everything is fine now, but based on research and Emily Walker's Wheel of Violence. After that honeymoon, it goes in circles and cycles. Again, there will be tension, explosion, distancing, and honeymoon. That was interesting, and it is really important to tell.
Так, чекаємо ще тоді відповіді на сьогодні по вебінару. Давайте ще тоді в частині Q&A
Now
задавайте ваші
in Q&A
питання конкретно, що б вас найбільше
section,
цікавило
you
по
can ask your
сьогоднішній темі.
questions about
Нагадаю, це
what
протидія
is
насильству
most
саме в
interesting for you
спілкуванні з
in
постраждалими,
today's
що ми
discussion,
можемо
and
зробити
this
як
is about
найкраще,
dealing with
щоб це
survivors,
вживали,
what we can do for
який є
survivors,
алгоритм реагування, як найкраще це
algorithms
зробити,
to respond,
на
and
що
how
звертати
to do
увагу.
that best,
Тому
what we should pay
чекаємо.
attention to.
Так, чекаємо пані Марту. А я на секунду і чекаю ваші
And while
питання, а я на секунду
we are
відключусь,
waiting
спробую
for
зателефонувати
Marta
пані
and
Марті.
for your
Чекаємо, де вона є.
answers to this question, I will disconnect for a while and I will try to contact Marta to find out what's going on.
Так, і тому в пані Марти світло, вже появилось світло,
So
ще не
now
з'явився
Marta
інтернет, буквально
has
2-3 хвилини.
electricity
Нагадую, ми обоє в
on.
Україні,
She has not yet
ми
connected
на західній частині
to the
України, в
internet,
нас
so
зараз
just a
регулярно
couple of
пропадає світло.
minutes more.
В мене зараз
We're
світла
both in
немає,
Ukraine, in
в
the
пані
western
Марти
part of
пропало,
Ukraine, so
було,
there are
потім виключилось,
frequent
тому що
shutdowns. I
Марта
don't have electricity
зараз в
now,
неї
and
появиться. Такі
Marta lost her
реалії
connection, but now she's going
воюючої
to be
країни, на
back.
жаль,
These are
є такі нюанси.
realities.
Ми
This
дуже
is the
просимо вибачення
situation
за таку
of
затримку,
the
але
country at
ще
war.
буквально пару
Unfortunately,
хвилин, і
so
наш головний
sorry for
спікер
this delay.
повернеться в наш дзвінок
Couple
і
of
буде
minutes
продовжувати
more, and
саме
our
тему
speaker is
сьогоднішнього
going
вебінару.
to be back to
Я не
continue
бачу від вас
speaking
питань,
about the
коментарів.
topic of today's seminar.
Дійсно заохочую вас
And I see
подумати,
no
2-3 хвилинки подумати, що б найбільше вас цікавило по
more
темі
questions from
допомоги
you, and I
постраждалим.
do
Чи,
invite you
можливо,
to
у вас
think
є
a little
питання
bit what
по
would be
попередніх
most
вебінарах. Саме
interesting for
сьогодні у
you
вас буде можливість
in the
задати
framework of
ці
the topic
питання,
of providing
тому
support
що
for
це останній
survivors.
вебінар.
And
Після
today you,
цього
or
вебінару
maybe
вже буде
about the
доступне
previous two
тестування.
topics, because this is the last
І
webinar
пройшовши
today.
таке
And
успішне
after that, you
тестування, ви
will have
зможете
to
отримати
undergo the
сертифікат.
test. And after you've done that, you will be in the position to receive your certificates.
Так, повертається до нас пані Марта.
And now Marta is back.
Так, мікрофон.
Please unmute yourself.
Перепрошую, колеги.
I'm
Попала
Я
sorry,
пояснила ситуацію,
colleagues.
все окей.
The
Давайте зразу тоді
electricity was cut off. Yes, I've explained your situation, so we can immediately
до
proceed
нашої теми.
Тоді
with
я пробую ще
discussing the
раз.
theme. Okay, then let me try and
Видно загальний екран презентації?
can you see my slides now?
Так, все видно.
Ура.
Yes, we can
Добре.
see it.
Отже, я не буду
Okay.
вже представлятися, оскільки
So,
ми
without
вже це робили 2 рази.
introducing myself again,
І
since
сьогодні
I've
ми
introduced
маємо
myself
говорити
twice
про
already,
те,
let me immediately
як ми
proceed
можемо
with how
допомагати
we can
постраждалим,
help
як,
survivors
чого дотримуватися для того,
and
щоб
what we need to,
не нашкодити
which
і
requirements we need to comply with to
допомогти.
do no harm, but
Я
also to provide support.
завжди, коли починаю
And
з
always
роботу з такою
when
постраждалою,
I start working
мені
with another
досить
survivor,
часто приходить
quite often I think
на
about
думку така метафора допомоги на болоті.
this metaphor, helping in the swamp.
Коли ми маємо
I mean,
ситуацію з
when we have
людиною,
a
яка
situation
попала в таку неприємність, і
where
ми
someone finds
хочемо
him or
їй
herself
допомогти,
in this unfortunate
то
situation and we want to help them,
перше, є якісь такі основні моменти,
there are some key
на які треба
aspects
зважати.
that you need to take into
По-перше,
account.
нам потрібно
First, We need to
зберігати холодний розум і
keep
спланувати,
our
як ми будемо
head,
їй
mind cold. We
допомагати.
need to be reasonable.
Ми
We
не
need to
не
plan
можемо
how we are
робити
going to
якихось
provide that
різких
support.
рухів,
We cannot make
якось
um,
там різко стрибати,
emotional
бігти
decisions
там до
or
неї,
actions and run
відразу
towards that
кидаючись
person
в її
in
рятувати.
the
Тобто
swamp,
ми маємо
immediately
дуже
rush
виважено
to help
спланувати,
them.
як
We need
ми
to
можемо допомогти
rationally
цій людині
plan how we can provide
вибратися з цієї
some
неприємності.
assistance to this person,
Ми
how we
маємо
can
подбати
help
про
them get
себе,
out of that
тобто,
swamp. We
щоб,
need to
знаєте, тому що дуже
ensure
часто може
some
так
self-care
статися, є
because
небезпека,
it
що
often
ця
happens,
проблема
there is the risk
може нас
that the
затягнути в
problem
це
that
болото.
is
Ми
relevant for
можемо
them may also take us into that
обоє
swamp.
опинитися
I mean,
в цій
both of
проблемній
us
ситуації, тоді
may
нас треба
find
буде рятувати.
ourselves
А
in that
це не
problematic
хотілося б.
situation, and then we need to be rescued. And this is the
Що
situation
важливо?
that you want to
Важливо
avoid, of course.
слухати себе,
Then it's important to
думати про те,
listen to yourself, to
бути
hear
в контакті
yourself,
зі своїм
to be
тілом,
in
зі своїми
contact with your
емоціями,
own body and emotions,
там, не знаю, глибоко дихати, планувати,
breathe
розподіляти
deeply, plan,
тіло, щоб
and
були
balance the
такого
body
тиску на
so that
на
there were
те
no
саме місце.
excessive
І
tension in
щоб ми були,
particular
щоб ми мали
parts of the
якусь
body.
палку чи якийсь
And
шнурок, якийсь
you
інструмент,
need to have
щоб
some
цей
instrument, some
інструмент
stick or
можна було
whatever, some
дати
tool
цій людині і
that you could
допомогти їй
stretch, you could give to that
витягти
person in the swamp in order
цю
that he or she could get out
витягти її з цієї
by holding at it.
критичної ситуації. Ми маємо
And
відпочивати.
we also
Ми не
need to
можемо
give us
робити
rest.
все одні. Тобто
We
ми мусимо
cannot do everything
сподіватися
all
на те,
alone.
що людина, яка в цій
We
небезпеці,
can
вона
hope that the
співпрацює,
person in
щоб
the
вона
precarious
брала
situation
участь в
will cooperate, that this person,
в
that the
пошуку виходу
survivor will also
з
look
цієї
for ways
проблеми. Тобто
out of that
тут є
problematic
дуже багато
situation.
нюансів. Коли ви
So there are
починаєте
a lot
думати
of
про цю
these
метафору,
aspects. When you start
то
thinking about that
це
metaphor,
такий, з моєї точки зору, дуже добрий
I
шлях
believe that that's a very good
вийти
way to
на розуміння, що я
better
можу робити,
understand
що я не
what I
можу
can
робити.
do and
Тут
what I
також
cannot.
важливо, наприклад, щоб ми
Here
не
it
були
is
переобтяжені самі
also
якимись
important that
додатковими
we are not
якимись рюкзаками,
overburdened,
якимось важким
overwhelmed with some
взуттям. Це все
additional
треба
stuff,
зняти, коли ми
backpack or
рятуємо,
heavy boots. When
допомагаємо
you rescue
рятуватися
someone,
цій
you need to
людині.
take that
Ми
off.
всі оці обтяжуючі
So all of these
якісь фактори ми маємо
burdening factors,
відкласти в сторону.
we need to put them aside.
Також, якби
And that's also
метафорично, коли ми починаємо думати про те,
metaphorically,
що означає там той
when we
чи
start
інший
thinking about
момент
what
щодо
a
порятунку
certain
в болоті. Ми знаходимо дуже багато таких,
aspects
знаєте,
imply when we rescue someone in the swamp, we may see
кольорів
quite a
в
lot of
тому,
shades
що
and
ми
colors
можемо,
of
як ми
what
можемо
we
себе
of
найкраще приготувати,
how we
і
could
що ми
better
можемо
prepare for that
враховувати і маємо
act and what we need to
враховувати,
take into
щоб
account
ця людина
so that
в
this person
кінці кінців стала опинилася в
eventually
безпеці.
could be in the safe place.
Я вирішила поділитися цією
So
метафорою
I
як
decided to share this metaphor with you as an introduction
про що
for us to
треба
better
подбати. І тут
understand what
важливий
we need
момент,
to
що ми
take care of.
дбаємо,
And it's
звичайно,
important that, of
допомагаючи
course, we
людині, але
help the
також ми
person,
думаємо
but
про
we
себе. Ми
also
думаємо,
think
щоб ми
about
були
ourselves.
в
We
безпеці,
think about
щоб
that
ми
we
були
need
в
to be
ресурсі, щоб ми
safe,
мали цю палку
resourceful. We
чи
need
цей
to have that
шнурок,
stick or
яким
rope
ми можемо
or
допомагати,
whatever
щоб
that
ми
we can use to help.
планували, тобто,
And we also need to plan.
щоб ми розуміли, що ми
So we need
робимо
to have a good
і для
understanding
чого,
of
для того, щоб
what we are doing
нас
and
також
why,
не затягла
so
ця
that we were
проблема.
not sucked into that swamp.
Так. І перший слайд,
And
який,
the first slide,
на якому я дуже часто зосереджуюся,
which I quite often
це так
focus on,
звана
is so-called
такий протокол
protocol
чутливого до
of
травми
trauma-sensitive approach,
який складається з 3
which
стадій.
includes
І
3
якщо
stages.
людина
And
не
if the
має
person
специфічної
does not have
освіти,
a specific
травматерапевти
background
чи
of a trauma
психотерапевти,
therapist or
чи
psychotherapist or
психологічної освіти, то
some
ми
psychological
зосереджуємося на
training,
першій стадії.
then we
Перша
focus
стадія,
on
якщо ви
stage
будете,
one.
якщо ви, наприклад, там
Stage one,
соціальні
yes, if you
працівниці чи
are a social worker, for example,
волонтерки, які
or a
допомагають. Дуже
volunteer
багато таких людей працює в
providing
нашій
help.
тематиці.
A lot of people
І
like that work
ви можете
in
зробити
our
дуже багато, зосереджуючись
topic,
виключно
and you
на
can
першій
do a
стадії
lot simply
допомоги.
by
Це стадія
focusing on the
теперішня,
first
про
stage.
стабілізацію,
That's the stage about
про
now,
безпеку.
about
Тобто
stabilization,
тут
about
основне, на
providing
що
a sense of
ми
security.
зосереджуємо свою
The
увагу,
most important
це
point here
безпека.
we are
Тобто
focusing
ми
on is the
обговорюємо план
security.
безпеки з цією
We
людиною.
discuss
Тобто
the security
обговорюємо,
plan
що
with this
потрібно
person.
зробити
We discuss what needs
для
to be
того,
done
щоб
to
дистанціюватися від кривдника,
get away
щоб
from the
перебувати,
perpetrator, to
знайти безпечне
remain
місце,
remote
чи
from them,
збільшити
to find a
безпеку в
safe
місці,
place
де
or increase the security
де
in the place
проживає ця
where
постраждала. Тобто
the
ми зосереджуємося дуже
survivor
детально на
of
тому, що ми
this
можемо
violence
робити
lives.
для
So
того,
we
щоб
focus in much
відновити
detail on
безпеку.
what
І
we
це
can do
ключове. Коли ми
to
маємо
regain
роботу з
that sense of
насильством, ми
security.
завжди
So
думаємо
when
про
we work with the
безпеку.
violence, we
Ми
always keep thinking
можемо
about security. And we
починати
can start
говорити про безпеку
speaking about
постраждалих.
security
Але
of
часто так буває,
the
що
survivor, but quite often
наші
our
комунікації, наша
communications,
мова,
our language,
наша розмова не
the
дуже
conversation that we have is not
не
very
сприймається.
well
Вона,
perceived
там,
by
має
or
до слова, чи
understood by the survivor of violence.
якось
We
не
see
дуже
some
готова
resistance. She may
чути
not
про
be well
необхідність
prepared to hear
безпеки.
about
Тут
the
я
need
завжди
to achieve
там
the security.
посилаюся на
So
ті
here
дослідження,
I
якщо,
always
якщо є
refer
такі,
to some studies,
наприклад,
for example, about
про ці от дослідження, що
about
червоною зоною є
the fact that the
досвід,
red zone is the
коли
experience when
кривдник
the
душив
perpetrator
постраждалого.
was
Якщо
trying
був досвід удушення,
to
то це вже
well,
дуже такий небезпечний,
for example, to choke the
небезпечний
survivor. If
сигнал.
there
І
was an
в
attempt
Ірландії
to
були
choke
дослідження,
her,
які
that's a very
показали,
dangerous
що
signal. And the study in
значна частина,
Ireland
зараз не
has
пам'ятаю кількісно, але значна частина,
shown that
найбільше
significant part, I don't
постраждалих
remember now
загинуло
exactly the number,
в
but
результаті
the majority
удушення.
of
Тобто
the
удушення це
victims
такий
of
досвід насильства,
violence
коли
died
кривдник має
because of
максимальну
choking.
кількість
So
влади і
choking
контролю
is the
над
moment when the
життям
perpetrator has the
постраждалої
maximum
особи,
amount of
і
power and
він
control over the life
дуже
of
легко
the
ця от межа переходиться. Він може
of the
навіть і не
person
планувати
he
вбивство,
violates,
але
and
трошки
this
боротись
border
змусить,
is
він
very easy to
може
cross,
задушити.
even
І
without
коли я чую
planning
про те,
it
що він
beforehand.
мене
This
душив, я
can be
завжди
crossed, and
питаюся,
when
чи
I hear someone
було
saying
таке,
he
що
choked
ми,
me, then I start
він
whether
душив вас.
it
Якщо
has
я
been
чую,
that
що
he, for example,
відбувається таке, то тоді
yeah, tried to really choke you.
я
And if I
говорю про
hear
те,
that
що
it
це
did happen,
дуже
then I say, no,
небезпечний
that's a
факт.
very, very, very
І
dangerous
якщо
fact.
все ще
And if
є якісь такі
there
нерозуміння
are
того, що
still there is still some
збільшити
lack of
безпеку,
understanding that
якщо
more
є,
security
наприклад,
is
діти,
required.
я
If there are
починаю
kids, for
переводити
example,
розмову
then I
в
start speaking
причину
about
дітей,
children.
розповідаю про те,
I
наскільки це
speak about
згубно для дітей,
how
наскільки це
bad it is
небезпечно для
for
дітей. І тоді в такий
children,
спосіб
how it affects
також
them, how it
переводжу.
is
Ну, тобто нам
unsafe
потрібно
for them. And that is how
на першій
I
стадії говорити про безпеку.
motivate the
Говорити
survivor
про
of violence. We need to, on the
те,
first
як
stage,
вона,
yes,
що
we need
зараз
to speak
відбувається
about
і як
security, about we need to speak about what's happening now and
цю
how
ситуацію,
the situation
збільшити
can become
безпеку.
more
І тут ми
secure.
розглядаємо якісь такі ключові,
And here we
звичайні, дуже прості
consider some very simple, some
кроки,
very ordinary
якими
steps
можна рухатися в сторону
which
безпеки.
we can
Тобто
take to
ми
achieve this
плануємо,
security.
можливо,
So we are
вона
planning,
починає
maybe
там робити
she
копії якихось документів, якщо, наприклад,
makes
оригінали
copies of some documents she
неможливо
has. If the originals
отримати чи
are
забрати так
impossible to recover
без
without
наслідків.
consequences, you know,
І десь ці
and
копії залишити в надійному місці.
she
Ще,
stores those copies in
наприклад,
some safe place.
подумаємо про те,
And
які
for
люди
example, we
можуть,
may
до
think
яких
about
людей вона може
what people she can go
попроситися хоча
to
б на кілька днів
for
для
a
того,
few
щоб
days at least
побути в безпеці,
to
і потім
stay
там
safe,
вирішити далі, що вона
and
робить.
then decide what to do
Про
next.
якісь кошти, що куди
There
можна
are also
звернутися за
some
такою допомогою.
we talks about the money, where to get money, where you get support from. So very basic social steps, so that yeah, of course, further we will help you, help her, but without her being secure, well, our help will not be so efficient.
Основна, от тут зараз дуже ключовий
And
такий момент.
the most important
Основна
point here
мета
is that the main
нашої
goal of
інтервенції,
our
нашої
intervention,
допомоги – це відновлення
our
влади і
support
контролю
is
в її житті. Тобто
regaining
все,
the
що ми
power and
робимо,
control in her life.
це
So
відновлюємо
everything we
владу і
do
контроль.
is restoring this
Помагаємо відновити владу і контроль, щоб вона сама
power
почала
and control, giving it
вирішувати
back to her. We
в
help her
своєму житті
regain those. And she starts making
будь-які
decisions for
проблеми
herself,
і брала
resolving
участь
problems, so
в
she
цьому вирішенні.
takes
І ми
part in
починаємо з
decision
дуже
making.
невеличких кроків.
And we start with very small steps. And
Дуже
we are
часто
thinking, well,
обговорення
quite often
якихось
it's
процесів, як вона починає
discussing some
проходити владу.
processes, how she starts
Тобто
taking
якась
care
така
of
щоденна
herself,
рутина,
everyday
базова
routine,
щоденна рутина,
basic
як
daily
вона
things,
там дбає про своє тіло,
how she takes care
як
of her
вона
body, how she,
харчується, як вона спить. Тобто ми маємо
well, what she
відновити
eats, how she sleeps.
циклічність
So we need
щоденну.
to restore this
Тому що
daily
ця циклічність, вона дає їй структуру. А
cycles,
структура
because these cycles are
дуже
what
важлива
make her
для
secure, because
того,
it's
щоб
structured.
психіка могла опиратися,
Structure is very important
відновлюючи ті чи
for the
інші
mental health, for
такі
a person
базові
to be resilient and
життєві
restoring
процеси.
the
Тому
basic
я
life
завжди
processes.
досліджую, запитую про те, як вона спить.
That is
Тому
why
що
I
вже
always
говорили
ask
про те, що сон
them
це
about how they sleep,
один з
because
найважливіших
sleep is one of
помічників.
the
І дуже
biggest
важливо, щоб вона
helpers that we have.
спала, і не просто
And it is
спала
important
там
that the woman
якимись
sleeps
такими
and not just sleeps in patches,
періодами, щоб вона
in
спала
uneven
достатньо довго,
periods. Yeah, we
щоб вона
want her to have a
заходила
nice long sleep.
в безпечному місці, щоб вона
We
заходила
want
в
her
глибокий
to
сон.
fall asleep
Тобто
in a safe
сон
place,
ми дуже детально
deep
обговорюємо.
sleep.
І
That's what
якщо
we
є
discuss in
проблеми зі сном,
detail.
тому що
And
травма
if there are
досить часто
sleeping problems, because traumas
впливає
quite often affects the way we sleep,
на сон, то ми
then
це обговорюємо.
we
Ми
discuss
говоримо,
that
я
too.
можу скерувати,
So I,
наприклад,
for
на
instance,
консультацію до
can
психіатра для того, щоб
refer her to a consultation with
відновити
a
сон.
psychiatrist to restore the sleep,
Можуть бути
and
прописані медичні
that they may prescribe some medicines to
препарати для того,
her
щоб цей сон відновити. Це такі звичайні
to
процеси,
restore
але
the sleep
вони
process as it
на
should be.
старті вони
So
дуже
these
базові,
are
тому що
simple
нам
processes, but at the
потрібно
very beginning they are very
зробити
important. They
так,
are very
щоб
basic. We need to make it so that
психіка нам помагала, щоб
our
людина
well,
почала
mental part
запустилася оця
helped us,
система
so that this
самовідновлення. Ми
system
тоді
of
будемо
self-restoring
самі і
works
підтримувати, і допомагати
itself, and
також,
then we will
але
support it, of
цей
course, we
перший
will help it.
процес в цій
But this
метафорі,
first
коли ми
process in this
допомагаємо
metaphor,
врятуватися
when
людині,
we are helping a
це
person
так,
out of
якби
a swamp,
вона в цьому болоті знайшла якийсь
that's
твердий
as if
камінь.
she
Тобто і на
found
цей
some,
камінь
some
вона
solid
може
ground
стати
or
оця
some
безпека.
stone
Тому
inside that swamp, and she can
відновлення цих
stand on
базових
it
процесів
That's the role of security in the basic processes. That's the stone, the rock she will be able to stand on to eventually get out of the swamp, maybe even independently, if she remains safe, if there are positive trends after this, and we will just help her. We will pull her out of that swamp, of course. But the fact that she already feels that she stands on some solid ground, that's a key moment in the process of saving the person. And that is why I focus on that a lot. I insist on that. And this is something that can be done not just by psychologists or psychotherapists. It can be done by the people who are just near. And being near, being close is also very important resource because we all are very much socially oriented. And a person quite often cannot survive if isolated. And there are many examples of stories when people on isolated islands or in isolated prison cells, they just lost their mind, becoming insane. So our mind just cannot meet this challenge, being alone all the time. And to have safe, reliable relations, having some person to talk to, some person you can discuss with some steps planned to do to increase their security is a very important resource. And when we think about the experience of violence survivors, I will be speaking about that in more detail soon, then a very important negative influence of violence is isolation. And yeah, we discussed isolation at the previous meeting we had. Isolation is one of the important or key strategies of perpetrator used to establish the control and power over the life of the violence survivor. And the fact that the woman gets out of this isolation, starts talking to a safe person, and you as a person who accepts her, who is full of empathy, who is just near, you can be the only safe person in her life, just by showing sympathy and by accepting her experience without any recommendations or advice, without judgment or imposing some solutions. No, you just need to be near, you just need to be sympathetic and accepting. That's the position that is very therapeutic, a very helpful position, actually, a very good position, in my opinion, when we're just near, accepting her choice, accepting her experience, and being sympathetic without judgments, without questioning why it happened like that in her life and why she never asked for help before. So don't blame her. It is like, that's the content of this cooperation. It's very important. On the stage 2, we'll be speaking about the past. But this is something that needs to be done
спеціалізацію,
preferably
тобто, щоб
by specialists.
Це була
So this
фахова
should
людина,
be
тому
a
що
trained
якщо
expert,
травма
because
досить глибока,
in the
то
case
ми
that
можемо
trauma is deep,
просто
we
повторити
may
травмування,
simply
ретравматизувати цю людину і
re-traumatize
можемо
the
їй дуже
person
нашкодити. Їй
and
буде
make it
дуже
even
боляче,
worse.
вона повернеться, ну просто може
She will
знести
suffer, she
все,
will
що ви
be
вкладали,
hurt, and
може
she'll
знестися,
return to the
якщо
previous
ми
condition, and everything
не
we have invested
вдалий
will
спосіб
be ruined,
почнемо
because if we
працювати
start
з травмою.
talking with the
І
trauma
перед тим, як іти в
in
травму,
an
ми
incorrect
маємо
way,
перевірити
and before starting
безпеку
processing the
і
trauma, we
ресурс.
must check
Тобто
that she
безпека і
is
ресурс, наскільки людина
secure
має
and has the
вже
resource.
на
What that
чому
means,
стояти, на що
whether she
опиратися,
has that rock under her
наскільки
under
вона
her feet.
там
Yes,
є люди, на яких вона може
whether
покластися, до
there are
яких вона може звернутися
people she can rely
за
on, she
допомогою.
can ask for help.
Якщо
And
це
if
відбувається, то тоді ми можемо
this
скерувати
happens
до
like that,
психологів,
then
які
we can refer her
допоможуть
to psychologists who will
інтегрувати
tell her to
травматичний
integrate the traumatic
досвід, тому що інтеграція
experience,
травми є
because
важливою, тому
integration
що
of
для
the
того,
trauma is
щоб
important
втримувати цей травматичний досвід, ми
to
дуже багато
be able to
витрачаємо
deal with
внутрішнього
traumatic
ресурсу. Ми дуже
experience. We spend a lot of
обмежуємо
internal resource. We
якби
limit
спектр своєї
our activities, our lives, and communications a lot.
зважаємо у своїй
We
поведінці
consider
на те,
that
щоб не
traumatic
повторилася
experience in
травма.
our
Тобто,
behavior, trying
і
to
тут,
avoid it.
ну, фактично, дуже
And
важлива
here,
ця
basically,
переробка травматична. Але
this
знову ж повторюю, що це має
trauma
робити
processing is very
фахівці.
important, but that is something
На
that needs
третьому
to be done
етапі
by
ми
trained
працюємо з
specialists
горем, ми
again.
працюємо з
And on the
плануванням
third
майбутнього, з цінностями. Людина
stage, we
починає
work with the
розглядати
future, we
своє життя з
do
іншої
the
перспективи,
grieving,
тобто
but
вона
then
починає
we see a
думати, що далі, і ну, це такий
new beginning. So the
досить
person starts to see in her
такий
life a new, thinking
важливий
about what's going
також
to happen
етап,
next. What
який,
will she do?
в якому
That's
ми
also an
теж
important
будемо
stage
поряд і
where we also
допомагати
must be
цій
near,
людині. Тут
providing
я
support to this
повторюю
person.
те,
So
що
here
ми,
I will
коли
repeat
спілкуємося
the
з нашою
things
постраждалою,
that we
ми
use
не вживаємо
working
слово
with the
жертва,
survivor.
ми
We
не
don't say
говоримо про те, що
victim.
вона
We don't say that she was
піддалася насильству,
subject
тобто
to violence,
що вона дозволила це насильство,
or
що
she
вона
allowed the violence, or
спричинила це
she
насильство,
caused it, provoked
спровокувала це
herself.
насильство. Тобто тут ми дуже
We
уважно
must be very careful with the
дивимося
wording.
на свою
We
мову.
must
І
be very careful about what we
натомість
say, and
ми
instead we
використовуємо
use
наступні слова.
the
Вона
following
вижила,
words. We say that
вона
she is a
врятувалася,
survivor, she
вона
rescued
перемогла це
herself,
насильство,
she
вона
overcame
вціліла.
that violence.
Тобто ми
Yes,
говоримо
she
тут мовою.
survived.
Я
So in
часто
our
кажу
language
про те,
here, I
тому що вони
often
дуже,
speak about
дуже
this
часто себе
because
звинувачують
very
через
often these survivors
трошки далі
tend to
ми будемо
blame
говорити.
themselves. We will be
Я тут
speaking
в
about
мові
that. And
говорю
in
часом про те,
well,
що
when we speak about the
я
language,
захоплююся тою
I
силою,
often say that I
яку
am inspired
вона
by the
демонструє, яку
strengths
вона
that
має,
they show.
працюючи з в
I
цьому напрямку
admire
виходу з
how they
насильства.
work to get
Тою
out of
силою,
the
яку
violent
вона має,
situation,
просто
and
звернувшись по допомогу,
I admire the
щоб
strengths
змінити цю
they
ситуацію. Вони
demonstrate
дуже
just
уразливою
asking for
людиною,
help
вони
to change
дуже
the situation.
мало
These
мали
women are
сил. І перший
very
той крок,
much
який
affected and
просто
they are very much vulnerable. And
вона
that
робить
step she
для того, щоб
makes
поговорити, щоб просто
to
дослідити
talk to,
можливість
even
виходу з цієї ситуації,
try
вона
the
потребує
opportunity to
від
get
неї
out of
значно
that situation.
більших
It
ресурсів,
requires much
ніж,
more resources
наприклад,
than, for
людина,
example,
яка
from a person who
не перебуває в такому
is not in
вразливому
such a vulnerable
стані,
situation.
як ця, припустимо, постраждала
as this survivor
хронічного насильства чи
as a result
важкого
of
насильства чи
many years of
зловживань,
violence or
тобто
severe
від
violence or rape.
такого сильного
I mean,
травмування.
where the situation is severely traumatizing.
От. І зараз
And now
дуже важливий ланцюжок,
this is a
по
very
якому
important
іде,
chain
по якому проводить
that illustrates
постраждалих соціум, патріархат.
development of what the patriarchy, the
тих
society takes our
емоцій
survivors
і
through.
почуттів,
These are
які
dynamics
приводять
of the
до
emotions and feelings
ізоляції.
that result in isolation.
Перший рівень, на якому
First,
на
the
якому
first
ми завжди
level
бачимо
that we
звинувачення постраждалих, це
where we see
вина.
that
Вона відчуває
the
вину. Я
perpetrator, that survivors are blamed, that is guilt. They feel guilty, the survivors.
Була дуже поширена книга
Some time ago,
Шерил Спінберг,
the book
по-моєму, я не
by
пам'ятаю, які вона
Cheryl
була
King
якоюсь
or
там
whatever, I don't
топ-менеджером
remember her
в
name, but
Гуглі
she was
чи
a
в
top
Фейсбуці.
manager of
І
Google
вона
or
сказала
Facebook, so her book was very popular. And there she
таку фразу:
stated the
покажіть
following:
мені жінку
show me a
без
woman
почуття провини,
without
і я вам
feeling
доведу,
of
що це чоловік.
guilt, and I will prove that that's a man.
Соціалізуємося
I
в
mean,
такий спосіб, на жаль,
we
що
socialize in a
ми
way,
винні.
unfortunately,
Ми винні
where
в тому,
we
що
are
відбувається з
guilty.
нами.
We are guilty of what
Дуже
happens to
часто,
us.
навіть
Very
зараз,
often,
в нас
even now,
зараз був така дуже
now
велика хвиля
we
обговорень
had this
зґвалтувань,
wave
можливо, ви чули
of
на
discussion
війні.
of
І
situations
навіть
of
в цих
rape at war.
ситуаціях
Maybe you heard about that,
соціум
war-related rapes. And
умудрявся
even in those situations,
звинувачувати
in
цих
those discussions,
постраждалих
the
в тому, що
society managed
відбувалося.
to find ways to
Ці
accuse
жінки
the
розповідали про те,
survivors of
що
what happened.
мене запитують, чому ти вийшла з
The
цього підвалу,
women say,
чому ти не
they
виїхала
tell me,
вчасно.
why did you
Бачила,
get
що
out of the basement?
всі
Why did you
виїжджають з
leave that
цієї
territory timely? You could
території.
see
Чому
everyone
ти
leaving. Why did
залишилася?
you decide to
Тобто,
stay back?
фактично, що
So
відбувається?
actually, what
Соціум
happens? The
дуже
society
стигматизує, тобто
stigmatizes
виділяє від себе, витісняє від
or
себе
rather
цю постраждалу або цілу групу
represses or
постраждалих.
pushes away this survivor
І
or a group of
вони
survivors or
відчувають
people
вину.
affected,
Вони дійсно
and they
починають
feel
думати,
guilt.
що можливо
They
дійсно,
start
чому я
thinking,
вийшла тоді з тої,
why
з
did
того
I
місця, де я була,
leave that
що
shelter or
що я
basement?
могла зробити
What
по-інакшому.
could
І
I
мозок
do
починає
differently?
так, знаєте, циклічно думати,
So
що
her
треба
mind
було зробити інакше. І
starts
це треба
cyclically
зупинити. Тобто
processing, thinking about what
вина –
could have been
це
done
перша
differently.
сходинка, яка нам
And that needs to be
сигналізує про те,
stopped
що вона
because
вже
guilt, this is the first
в
thing
цій
that is a signal
динаміці.
for us
І
that shows that she
наступний,
is caught into that
наступна
dynamic.
сходинка
And the next step
це
then
сором.
would be shame.
Сором це ключовий такий,
Shame
ключове
is
відчуття, на яке ми дуже
the
сильно
key feeling
звертаємо увагу,
that
тому
we are
що
very focused on.
сором за деякими
Because
дослідженнями
shame, according to certain surveys,
є передвісником
is a
суїцидальності. Тобто ми
precursor
на
of
сором дуже
suicidal
зважаємо.
ideation.
Ми соціально,
So we really
соціально такі орієнтовані.
are very much focused on shame. We are socially oriented, how to put
створіння.
it. We are
І
socially
сором
guided
це
or
соціально
creatures,
орієнтована,
so to say, and shame is
соціально
social.
орієнтоване відчуття. Ми,
This is a social
коли
feeling.
відчуваємо сором, це дуже
When we
часто
feel
про те, що ми
shame,
втрачаємо
often it is about that we
соціальну цінність, ми
lose
втрачаємо
social value,
якийсь
we
там
lose
статус,
certain status,
втрачаємо контакти з
we lose
важливими
contact
людьми.
with
І
significant
насильство, оці
people.
ієрархічні стосунки,
And
коли
violence and this hierarchical
людина
relationship
здійснює
where
владу і контроль,
someone has
це
power and
по
control
суті дуже якби наповнена соромом взаємодія. Я
That is
перетворююся
the
як
interaction that is
на
full of filled with shame.
недостатню якусь
I
там людину,
then transform, I
над
turn
якоюсь,
into
я
someone who
перетворююся на
is
об'єкт,
inferior. I
на
turn into an object.
там, я регресую дуже
I
часто в
regress.
цих стосунках.
Often
І
regression
сором
happens
це
in this kind of relationships.
відчуття, яке
And shame,
породжує
that's the feeling that gives rise to,
породжує така взаємодія, ієрархічна взаємодія.
that
Це
is
дуже
risen as a
такий
result of this hierarchical interaction.
патріархатний
This
вплив
is a patriarchal
на
model and the impact
на
of the
мої
patriarchal
відчуття
society
на
on my
стан
feelings and
того,
on my
як я себе почуваю. Тут
self-perception.
важливо пам'ятати,
And
що
here it is important to
сором
keep in
це
mind that shame
в одному ряду з приниженням, коли ми
stands in the
маємо
same
цю
line as humiliation
динаміку,
when we have this
насильницьку
dynamic
динаміку. Це
of
дуже про
violence.
якесь
That's
таке
very much
неприйняття
about
себе, про відразу до себе, про
non-acceptance of oneself,
якісь
self-loathing,
такі ганьбу таку, що
self-shaming,
я там не маю права жити, і це
that I have no right to
таке
live.
дуже часто відчуття безчестя, якщо особливо ми маємо
And
сексуальні
it
скривдження. Тобто
is the
сором
situation of
це друга
disregard
така
and
дуже
lack of dignity if
скажімо,
we
сходинка,
find
яка
ourselves in the
веде
situation
нас
of
до
violence. So
ізоляції,
shame
до
is the next
мовчання
step that takes us
і до
towards
синдрому
isolation, silence,
недостатності.
and the
Тобто
learned helplessness syndrome.
третьою такою
So
фінішною
the
прямою, скажімо, є
third
те, що я
and the final
вирішую,
step,
що
this is
я не
where
буду
I
взагалі
decide
про
that
це
I will
говорити.
not
Те,
speak
що ми
about that.
зараз маємо, наприклад, в
This
Україні
is
з
what we see now in
жінками,
Ukraine
яких зґвалтували під час війни,
uh,
дуже часто вони
for
відмовляються від
women raped
будь-якої допомоги. Вони
at war. Very
дуже
often
ізольовані, вони
they reject
не
any
мають
kind of
жодного
assistance.
контакту.
They are often very
Якщо вони
isolated. They
звертаються
have
по
no
допомогу
contacts.
тільки до
And if they
медиків і
do come for
медсестер,
help,
то
they
наполягають
only
на дуже
ask
анонімному
for
зверненні.
some
І
medical care,
ця
and they
потреба
insist on
ізоляції
their
– це, власне, фініш
confidentiality. And this
цієї
need for isolation, this is the
такої
final step
такого ланцюжка,
of this
який
chain
починається з провини.
that starts
І,
with guilt.
власне, з такими парадигмами
And with these
працювала,
paradigms,
ну, я би сказала, що вона ікона
this woman worked. She's
роботи
actually
з
an icon
жінками, які
of work
постраждали
with
від
women, female survivors
насильства,
of
Джудіт Герман.
violence. This is Judith
Вона зараз
Herman.
живе і працює,
She
далі
now
продовжує
lives and keeps
працювати в Сполучених
working
Штатах Америки.
in the
Її
US.
книжки
Her
перекладені
books have
на
been
основні мови, і
translated into
це
key
базовий
languages,
підручник для тих,
and this
є
is
точки
like
зору
a
для тих, хто
handbook
працює
for
з
those who work
постраждалими від
with
насильства
survivors of
жінками.
violence.
Вона робить в цій книжці, яка
In
тут
her book
сфотографована,
that you
вона
see
робить
on the
таку
screen,
паралель між
she
жінками,
suggests this
які
parallel between women
пережили насильство, та
survivors of
людьми,
violence
які
and those people
пережили війну,
who
які
survived
воювали.
a
І
war,
вона
who
показує
were
оцю
at war, who were combatants.
динаміку, дуже
So
близьку
she shows
динаміку.
these
І
dynamics,
Джудіт Герман,
which are very close.
окрім цієї
And
книжки,
Judith
вона
Herman,
досить
apart from
добре
this book,
описала
she
роботу з
also offers
постраждалими.
a
В
very
неї
good
є
description
окрема
of work
книга
with
про
survivors. There is another book
групову роботу з
on
постраждалими, з
group therapy,
протоколом,
group
з
work with
описами
survivors.
всіх
She suggests a
зустрічей, які
protocol,
вони,
description of
як вони
all the
відбувалися.
sessions that
Тому
they
що
hold there.
фактично до Джудіт
Because
Герман
actually,
мали
before
таку
Judith Herman,
таке упередження, що і
we had this
до
bias.
недавнього часу ми також мали
Until recently,
таке
we had this
упередження,
bias
що люди в травмі не мають
that people in trauma,
працювати в групі.
they
Тому
should
що
not work
травма
in groups because trauma resonates with
ми
other
отримуємо
people and
ретравматизацію.
then we
Джуді
re-traumatize
Герман
people. However,
змінила
Judith Herman
цей підхід, і вона
busted
доказала,
this
що
bias and she
групова
proved
робота
that group work
під певним таким фокусом має
under
дуже великий
certain
зміст, коли ми
circumstances,
говоримо
certain
про
focus
людей
is very
в
important
травмі,
for people in trauma,
зокрема і особливо, якщо ми
especially
говоримо
and
жінок,
in
які
particular
постраждали
if
від
we speak
насильства.
about
Тому
women
що,
survivors
коли
of violence.
ми повернемося до попереднього
Because
слайду, і
when
ми
we go
згадаємо,
back to
що
the previous slide
основна
and
проблема
you
це
remember that the key problem is
сором і ізоляція,
shame
то
and
група,
isolation. So
вона
the group,
може
a group
дати
may
значно
offer
швидший ефект. Тут
much
важливо, що
faster
вони
effect.
не зосереджуються на
And it's
травматичному
important
досвіді. Вони
that
не йдуть в
they do
травму.
not
Вона
focus on traumatic
дуже
experience. They
чітко
do not go back to that
прописує,
trauma.
як
And she
встановлювати
clearly states
кордони,
how to set these
як
boundaries, how
слідкувати за часом,
to track time,
як зупиняти, коли людина йде
how to
в
stop
травматичний досвід.
someone when they try to approach
І
traumatic experience.
показує, як використовувати
And she
ресурс
explains how to
ресурс
use
групи для того, щоб
resources
людина
of the group resources, so
зцілювалася.
that it were
Тому що
wholesome
група це
healing.
є соціальний
Because a group is a social
соціальна
construct.
така, таке створення, так?
And there's
І
a
тут, коли
social organism.
групова
And where
динаміка
group
правильно
dynamic
задіяна, ми
is
можемо
activated
отримати
properly,
відновлення власної гідності,
we
коли
can work
людина
on
отримує відчуття, що
recovery,
вона важлива,
restoring of one's
що
dignity, where
інші
the person
люди
feels that
її
they are
поважають, а це ключове
important, they
для
matter, that
зцілення
they have
сорому.
respect of others. And that's
Коли,
key to
і якщо немає групи,
heal
то ми
shame.
можемо робити
And
це
if there is
в
no group,
індивідуальному консультуванні чи в
we can
індивідуальному
do that in individual
спілкуванні.
sessions,
Ми
counseling
даємо
sessions as
людині
well, or when
повагу
communicating
і
individually with the person.
відчуття власної
We
гідності, коли
show respect
вона
and
сама планує, коли вона сама вирішує,
we
не тільки
help them
супроводжуємо
retain
її.
their dignity. Where they
Дуже
plan, they
важливий
make
такий
decisions, we
етап
only
в
accompany
цьому
that.
і в груповому процесі,
An important phase in
про
the
що
group
говорила
process,
Джудіт Герман в своїх
as
книгах,
mentioned by
і в
Judith Herman in her
індивідуальній
books,
терапії,
and also
це
in individual therapy.
період, коли ми маємо
That's the period
обурення,
where
коли
the period of
починається
indignation, I mean,
обурення від
where
того,
there is
що
indignation
її гідність порушили. Це
with
настільки
that
важливий
the fact that
період,
one's
момент,
dignity
коли я
was
маю
violated. I mean, that's a
своєму
very important
спілкуванні з
moment.
постраждалою
When I
обурення,
when I work with a
коли вона приходить
survivor
і
and
каже,
when I
слухайте,
see
я
her
тільки зараз
indignated,
розумію,
when
наскільки
she comes and she says, it's
що,
only now
що
that
він
I
зі
have
мною робив,
realized
що
what
вони
he
зі мною
did
робили.
to
Тобто,
me or what they
і
did to me.
вона каже, я не розумію, як я могла це дотепер
The
не
survivor
бачити.
may say,
І це
I
для
do
мене,
not
коли
even
ми
understand
маємо
how
такий
I
етап,
could be
це для
blind
мене
to that.
вау.
And
Яка
when
вона
that happens,
гуманітарна,
for
вже
me, that's a
перейшла
wow
на
moment, because
інший
that means that the woman is cool.
такий,
That means that she moves
знаєте,
to
на
another
іншу площину, коли вона себе
plane
починає
where she
поважати, вона себе
starts
починає
having
цінувати,
developing
і вона
self-respect and
обурюється, що
self-value.
інші люди могли
And she is
з нею
indignated that the
здійснити
other
те,
could do
що
that kind of things to her.
здійснили. І це, власне,
And that
під таким ракурсом працюють ці
through
групи,
that
коли
prism, actually the
люди
groups work.
через співчуття,
That is
через
where with
повагу,
empathy,
через
respect,
я не знаю, захоплення
or admiration,
позбавляються від сорому, тому що
where they
в
get rid of
групі
their shame.
ми маємо, якщо це є безпечний
Because in a group,
простір,
if it
де
is
я можу
safe
говорити
space
про
where I can
свої
speak
вразливості, про
about
те, що мене
my
турбує,
vulnerabilities, about what
це
concerns
дуже
me, troubles
зцілюючий
me,
такий простір.
that's
І
very
е,
healing
ще одна
space.
дуже улюблена моя
Another
цитата. Я книжку Джуді
favorite
Герман
quote of mine.
називається «Щитала до дірок».
And actually, I've read Judith Herman's
Ну, є
books
кілька
from A
екземплярів,
to Z
я
and back.
час від часу
I have
повертаюся до
several
неї.
of her books.
І
From time to time, I go back to those.
дуже мені подобається така цитата
And
від Герман
I really like
про
this quotation
дилему травми. Вона
about
каже про
the
те, що
dilemma of trauma.
має
She says that
таку
trauma
дилему, що з однієї сторони
is about the
травма
following
хоче
dilemma.
бути
On the one hand,
витіснена,
trauma wants to be
тобто ми
repressed.
не хочемо про неї говорити,
We don't want to
ми
speak about
хочемо про
it.
неї забути,
We
ми
want to
хочемо,
forget
щоб цього
about
не
it.
було, стерти
We
з
want
пам'яті. Вона
to just
так часом
erase it
приходить до
from
мене і
our
каже,
memory.
я би хотіла
Sometimes
це
women
стерти
come
з
to me and
пам'яті.
they say, I want to
Це
erase
неможливо.
it from my memory, but that's not
Травма хоче
possible.
бути стерта з пам'яті.
Trauma
Але
wants
з
to be
другої
erased.
сторони, чому
However,
дилема
on the other hand, why there
травми?
is the,
Тому
I
що з
speak about
другої
the
сторони
dilemma,
травма
because
хоче
on the
бути
other hand, the
проговорена,
trauma wants to
вона
be
хоче бути
expressed,
розказаною, вона
spoken
хоче
up, spoken out,
вийти
narrated. Trauma wants to
з цієї людини, і
leave
якщо ми
the
є тою
confined space
безпечною
within the
стороною,
individual. And
котра
if we
буде
are the safe
слухати,
party in this dialogue,
котра дасть
ready to hear,
можливість, власне,
ready to
розповісти
make it
про
possible for the survivor
цей
to share
досвід, то
her
це
experience,
надзвичайно
then it is
важливий
so important.
контакт
That's
і
a very important contact
надзвичайно важливий момент в нашому
and an important
в
moment
нашій
phase
взаємодії, коли
in
ми можемо
our
допомагати.
interaction
І
when we
тут
can help.
людські
And
якості,
there, human
співчуття,
qualities,
емпатія,
empathy, compassion,
вони тут надважливі.
they are super important.
Йдемо далі. О. Так, тут я ще хочу
And
сказати
here,
про те, що
I would like to tell you
травма дуже часто
about that
фрагментує
trauma
нашу
often
пам'ять.
fragments our memory.
Ми не пам'ятаємо
We do
про
not really remember
якісь моменти,
about
просто
certain
витісняються
moments or
з
aspects. Some of
пам'яті.
them are repressed from our
І
memory.
дуже часто порушується наратив.
And
Що
often the
означає порушується наратив?
narrative is
Ми
broken.
не маємо
I mean that in
такої
that case, we don't
історії
have
від
the
початку до кінця.
comprehensive story that
Власне,
starts and ends.
деякі напрямки терапії що роблять?
And
Це
in some
відновлюють
therapeutic
і
approaches, they try
перепроживають
to
цю травму в
restore and
безпечний спосіб,
relive the
часом
trauma
переписують
in a
цей наратив,
safe
тобто
way. Sometimes they try
цей
to
травматичний
rewrite the
досвід
narrative.
в
So
безпечному
then this
стосунку
traumatic experience in safe
розповідається
contact
або
is
описується в
shared
залежності
or
від
described
різних напрямків
depending
терапії,
on
по-різному
the
це
approach, therapeutic
відбувається,
approach.
але
It may happen
власне,
in
коли
different
ми
ways,
вже
but when we
можемо
can
розповісти
share
про цю історію
this story
досить зв'язно, досить
in a more or less comprehensive way,
логічно
in a logical way,
і в так званому вікні толерантності, тобто
and within
в
that
стані,
window of
коли
tolerance,
ми
meaning in the state
не
where
демонструємо
we do not
таких неконтрольованих поведінкових проявів,
demonstrate, manifest
тоді ми можемо
uncontrolled
робити висновок, що ця травма
behavior,
інтегрована.
then
Тобто,
we can
чим
speak about integration of
чим
the trauma.
відрізняється інтегрований досвід
So what's
від
the difference between
неінтегрованого?
integrated
Тим,
and
що неінтегрована
non-integrated
травма
experience?
запускає наші
Non-integrated
неконтрольовані
trauma
реакції. Я починаю плакати, я
activates
починаю
our
труситися, я
uncontrolled
починаю
reactions. I
випадати з
start
реальності.
crying,
Це дуже
shaking,
важливі моменти,
trembling,
на які треба
dissociating from
зважати. Якщо
reality.
ви
These are important. It
побачили,
needs to
що
be taken into
людина,
account. If you
наприклад,
see
під дією там
that someone
якогось
under the impact
навіть там побачила щось, чи
of
понюхала
well,
щось, чи якесь
something like
слово
where they saw something or
вибиває її
perceived
з
some smell or hear a word that knocks
реальності,
them
чи
out
з
of reality
соціально схваленої поведінки, чи
or
вона
from
починає там
socially
якісь
acceptable
такі
behavior
неконтрольовані, вона не може собі дати раду сама
where they cannot
з цими
cope
поведінковими проявами, то це
themselves
означає, що
with those
ми наблизилися до
behaviors,
травми,
then it means that we approach trauma, that we touch upon a very sensitive, painful, sore place. And there it is important that if we don't have the tools to heal the trauma, it's important to step back and make it possible for the person to accumulate the resources to help them to come back to normal.
And when we see that a person is traumatized, when she responds in a way that she cannot bring herself to the initially good condition or to socially acceptable behavior, which actually affects her very much, or maybe she's in dissociation. Quite often we encounter dissociative behaviors. Then it is important when we are close, when we are together, it's important for us to start helping her. Well, how can we do that? There are many materials and books about how we can provide psychological first aid. I think these are important knowledge and skills which should be mastered by all the people working in supportive occupations. So basically, if to speak about it brief, in a very brief way, speaking about only the most important processes that we can use to help, then, well, first of all, we need to restore this, to return this person to reality. And here, everything we can use is okay. Everything that works is good. We return her to reality through feeling, through senses. We can give her to smell something, I don't know, some aromatic oil, you know, in some offices they actually have some stock, or give her something cold in her hands. So for example, it's winter now, give her some snow, so that these sharp feelings, sharp senses, they remove a person from dissociation. Or something warm. For example, if you have hot tea in the cup, well, not to burn her fingers, of course, but just to give her a feeling of it, for her to touch it, to show a contrast of temperature, or maybe something spicy, I don't know, to kick off this reaction of the body. And then it makes her, it brings her out of this condition. Or you take her some stone in her hand, so she touches it, it's very solid, very hard, help her sort of grasp it, press it. So it's important for us to provide her with some contrast senses, or even a little bit of pain, not like real pain, but a tiny bit of pain, acceptable pain, when we help a person, when we provide first psychological first aid uh, to help her return from the traumatic shock or from the acute reaction to the trauma that she has just experienced, or if she dissociated under the well, memory of some traumatic experience. It is very important to help her to return to the reality. Some survivors of violence know that they are falling out of reality, so to say. They are aware of it, and it has a name. It's called dissociative disorder. And when that happens, well, first of all, I must say that any symptom is an attempt of your mind, of your mental part to try to deal with some problem. And if we see a dissociation or freezing, then that means that the mind tries to survive, to deal with the problem, to cope with it, maybe trying to hide, trying to protect itself from new piece of violence. So it has deep explanations of the mental mechanisms that are used for that. But you need to know that these are survival responses. All these things are a result of the trauma that has taken place. And some survivors are aware that they can fall out of the reality. And I have a client, for example, who simply falls down. Yeah, she gets unconscious, no symptoms of epilepsy or other disorders like that. When a person gets unconscious, it's dissociative disorder. She uh, has had very severe trauma. She was sexually exploited. She was forced to sex work, and she had been raped in her childhood. So very strong traumas. And that was the way her mind learned to fall out of their reality to, well, preserve itself, to survive. And as soon as she has any contact with the trigger, she simply falls down. And they quite often explain, they say, yeah, I have this problem. And then we start working on that. We start processing, start creating very similar means of self-help that might actually help her or might not, but we need to try that, right? So, for example, usually they understand that, well, now I'm going to fall down, yeah? So it's not like out of a blue sky. No, that's nothing happens now. I'm falling. No, she feels it's going to happen, and when she has this a little bit of space between triggering and mental response, she can do something to keep her in the reality, and we work through the list of what may help her. For example, it can be, well, with this client of mine, she always has something sharp in her pocket, and she has some, triangles with sharp corners, some children's toys. Yeah, she starts pressing them, grasping them in her fist, feeling the pain in her hand, and that's something that keeps her in the reality. A very common recommendation is a rubber bracelet, for example. When she feels that she is going to get out of reality, she just starts pulling this piece of rubber and hitting her body skin with it. It causes pain, again to keep within the reality. The best support, the best help you can provide if you see the person freezes, falling out of contact, it's to change the position of the body and start make her move. I always tell her to get up, to walk from a wall to a wall, so for her to do something together with me. So we start doing some physical exercises together. Something very simple like sit and stand up a few times. Breathing really helps, especially in such conditions. Pay attention to the exhaling. I like this formula that in all the breathing exercises we take pay special attention to exhaling. We don't care about inhaling. The body will inhale what it needs. But when we exhale, we pay attention to that. We need to get all the air out, everything that we have breathed in before, and then we inhale like we want, and we exhale again in a way to expel all the air out of our lungs. And this special attention to breathing is good. And there are real like directions, real fields in therapy linked to breathing exercises. That's mindfulness oriented therapy. There are many resources on the internet. There is even such appendices to applications for mobile phones which you can use to practice mindfulness. And I also practice this with my clients. I train them to do this very brief meditations when we jump out of this rumination of the daily routine of the autopilot system of existence. When we try to jump out of this autopilot and focus on feelings of the body, on our five senses. When we speak about this, I tell them about these five senses, this touch, the sight, the taste, and so on. So we agreed that in such situations, she will test what she feels, what she hears, what she feels inside her mouth, the taste, the feeling in the body, and so on. So we work through those mini meditations because yoga in such cases is not universal, because yoga quite often may trigger, because very often we take the poses, those asanas, they may be triggering, especially for those who have been through sexual violence, and we're very careful about like returning to yoga, for example. So we discussed that, of course, but yoga is not always the universal response for such cases, even though there is an opinion that yoga is a universal thing, but I have the opinion that we need to be very careful about such tools. And another block, a whole list of opportunities of things that help us to return the person to a normal state are cognitive techniques, which help us to draw attention to something else, to stop this dissociation. For example, I tell her, calculate from 1000 minus 13 or from 100 minus 13. When she starts counting, when we count, actually, we switch to another mode. We activate other parts of the brain. Or when I say, name me some animals, the names of which start with A or B, whatever, any letter. So there is there are classic exercises like five in this room, five find five objects of the same color. That's the way to activate these other parts of the brain that are called neocortex. Or there are other terms too. And this may be very helpful too. So cognitive exercises turn into some, well, cognitive activities. Well, I have this approach in this regard. I ask, well, what are the ingredients of the Ukrainian borscht? And she tells me, like, yeah, that's beetroot and potato. And that's what we need. When she starts recalling these things, she is distracted. She's here with us. And that helps us a lot. Yeah, let us move on because I've been a bit too talkative on this slide. Yeah. So here are the main signs which we can use to check if something's wrong, so we can assume that a person has some traumatic experience. For example, she may have problems with managing her emotions. She quickly switches to such an aggressive strategy when she starts shouting or she starts defending some positions of hers, blaming other people in a very, rude form, actually, when she is very angry, very irritable. And we see that a lot because we work a lot with people in trauma who are internally displaced persons, and they have a lot of reactions which may irritate. And our administrators of shelters have meetings, and when well, I often hear, well, I'm trying to help her, I'm asking her, and she instead starts shouting at me, blaming me for something. No, you need to understand it's not her who does that, it's the trauma which is trying to protect her this way. That's a symptom helping her to survive. And the worst signs of that is, well, when she shouts, it's great. I always say that if she is shouting, that's nice. If she's yelling, that's okay. She's not very deep. She's not far away. She has a resource and she can defend herself. But it's worse when she's not yelling. These are very convenient clients when she freezes, when she's emotionally dead. She's very distant. She just sees in her corner in the room and she does not accept any kind of contact. That's where we need to provide more support. We need to understand that the person is just frozen She has this absent-minded stare looking somewhere or deep inside her. Then we need to pay more attention to such a person.
Надмірна втягнутість або
Yeah, and
емоційність.
a lot of too much emotion,
Такі
or
ознаки, то це також
yeah, that's also the situation when she feels guilty,
виснаженість,
and
розсіяність,
that's
відчуття безнадії,
exhaustion,
замикання
feeling
і вживання
hopeless,
психоактивних речовин.
avoiding,
З
and
вживанням
using
психоактивних
the
речовин
psychoactive substances. Now, talking about the psychoactive
це досить часто є те,
substances,
що вживання
that's
психоактивних
something
речовин
that
є таким
is
копінгом,
often
таким знеболюючим,
a
таким
coping, a sort
анестезією,
of
такою,
painkiller,
яку люди
anesthetics, something that
застосовують для
people
того, щоб
use
знеболити
to
травму.
stop feeling
Я
pain from the trauma.
маю
And I
кілька клієнток
have
зараз навіть,
right now several
котрі
clients
кажуть про
who
те, що я вже не можу
tell
собі
me
дати
that,
раду
well, I
з
cannot cope with it
психоактивними
anymore.
речовинами, наприклад,
I
з алкоголем.
can't
Я кожний вечір дуже сильно
get out of
тягне,
alcohol use, for example.
щоб
Every
почати
evening
вживати
I
алкоголь,
get drunk. I
щоб
get this craving all
виправити
the
і
time, every
забути,
evening.
щоб
I
зменшити
want to
цю
drink
біль.
and forget
Ми маємо
to reduce the pain. And here we
застосувати
need to use
там певні протоколи для
certain
того, щоб людина
protocols to
почала
help
зупинятися
person
з
stop.
цими психоактивними речовинами, але також
To
ми
stop
маємо розуміти,
using
що
psychoactive substances, but we
може
also
таки
need to
бути,
keep in mind that
що
it may be
таке
so
вживання
that
психоактивних речовин
such use of
дає
psychoactive
їм
substances
виживання. Якщо
is a survival
травмування
thing for
дуже
them.
сильне,
If
дуже
the trauma
глибоке,
is too severe, too deep,
то ми можемо,
then we may
наполягаючи на тому, щоб людина
insist
перестала
that the person
вживати, наприклад,
stops
алкоголь чи інші психоактивні
drinking
речовини,
alcohol or
ми
using other
ризикуємо, що
substances. So
вона
if we insist
просто
on
буде
that too hard, we take the risk that then the person will be
змита тою хвилею травми,
overwhelmed, washed off
від якої вона
with that
рятується.
wave of
Тому
trauma that they are
дуже
trying to
важливо
defend themselves
говорити
from.
про те, щоб
So it is
в мене
important
от
to
зараз ця
speak about
клієнтка,
that.
котра
Well, now this client
про
of
яку я
mine
вам говорила,
that
котра
I
виходить,
have mentioned who
в котрої дисоціативний розлад,
has
вона
dissociative disorder,
має дуже добрий
dissociation disorder. So she
досвід
has
подолання залежності.
a
Вона мала
experience of
залежність від
overcoming
ін'єкційних наркотиків,
addiction.
вона
She
була
was
від
addicted to
алкоголю
injection
ковід-залежна,
drugs,
але
then she was
вона
addicted to
дуже добре
alcohol,
дає раду. В неї
but
дуже
she is quite
сильний
efficient
імпульс-контроль,
overcoming that. She has
і
very
вона
good
може це
impulse
зробити, в
control.
неї є це в
She can do
досвіді, на
that.
це я
She
можу
has had that
опиратися.
in her
Але
experience.
зараз,
She can
коли
rely on that. But now,
відбувся дуже
after
небезпечний випадок, коли
a very
її
hazardous thing
знайшов її
happened to
кривдник,
her,
і
her
відбулося травмування,
perpetrator found her
вона
and
знов
she was
почала
traumatized.
дуже сильно
After that,
пити. Вона вже
she
напила багато
once
років,
again took
і
to
зараз вона
drinking
почала
alcohol.
дуже
She
сильно
hadn't done
пити.
that
Коли я з нею
for several
говорю, вона
years,
коли
but now
випиває,
she's
вона до
again
мене дзвонить і
using alcohol. After
ми
she
з
has
нею
had some
говоримо.
alcohol,
І
she may
є такі
call me and
підходи,
we
котрі
may talk
кажуть,
to
що
each other.
не
And there are these
працюйте з
approaches where they
людиною
say, don't work with
під
someone
алкогольною
who is
залежністю,
under
в
effect
алкогольному
of alcohol
стані
or who is
алкогольного
addicted to
сп'яніння. Це є
alcohol. That's
там немає там можливості роботи зі свідомістю,
not
то
really
не
possible to
працюйте.
then work
Я
with their
дуже часто
conscious
говорила
level,
і
with their
пам'ятаю,
mind.
що
But I remember I often
подзвоніть мені,
told
коли
to
ви
this
будете
client,
твереза.
please call me when you are
Я не
sober.
маю права з вами
I
говорити, коли
cannot talk to
ви
you
в такому стані.
or
І
deal with
я
you
брала
when
навіть
you are
супервізії по цій
in that
клієнтці,
state. And
і
I even had supervisions on that
і
client
ми на
case.
цих супервізіях
And at
знайшли
those
таку,
supervisions,
я зрозуміла,
or
що
I
насправді це
realized
копінг,
that
який потрібно
actually
прожити, і ми
that's a
маємо
coping
поважати цей
thing.
копінг.
This is something that
Я
makes it possible
промовляюся
for
з
her
нею,
to
що,
survive, and we need to respect that.
ну, що
I
зараз,
agree with
якщо вона
her
не може
that now,
робити, то
if she cannot stop
вона не
drinking,
кидає пити.
then
Але
she
я
does
її
not
просто
stop
прошу,
drinking.
щоб
But
вона
I
дзвонила
ask
до
her
мене,
to call me
коли є довший
when
період
she is
невживання.
in
Наприклад,
longer
щоб
periods
вона
of
дзвонила зранку.
non-drinking in the
Тобто
morning, for
мені
example.
важливе,
I mean, what's important
важливий
for me
хоча б віконечко
is
свідомості,
that there is at least
коли ми
some
зможемо поговорити. Я не
window,
можу,
some period of time when she is sober, when she is conscious. I cannot really harshly deprive her of this coping mechanism that helps her survive. I believe that's important.
Такий прорив в нашій роботі.
And because that's an important breakthrough in our work, and that significantly improved her capacity to be in contact with me because she's no longer ashamed, she no longer feels guilty when she calls me when
Ми
she's
просто говоримо
high
про те,
or
що я з
drunk.
нею говорю про те,
So
що
I just talk to
я
her
можу з вами працювати тільки коли ви
about
там
that I can only
кілька
work
годин,
with
хоча б
you
6 годин не
if
вживали
for
алкоголю.
several
Давайте
hours, like 6
домовимося.
hours, you
Тоді я
have
вже з
not
нею
had any alcohol.
починаю
Let's
в
agree.
такому стані там контактувати її з
And
її
then in
ресурсом,
that state,
опиратися на її якісь
I
там
try to
позитивні
establish
спогади.
contact with her
Тобто
resources,
намагаюся
rely on
її
her
витягнути
positive
на якийсь
memories.
інший рівень,
So I try
допомогти
to
їй
bring her
знайти
to another level,
оцей камінь під ногами, від
to
якого вона може
find this
відштовхнутися і почати
kind of
вилізати з цього
firm ground
болота.
under her feet that she can rely on to start
Є
getting out of the
ще
swamp.
одна прекрасна,
There is another
прекрасна
great
наша сучасниця,
uh,
яка
contemporary
сама
writer.
пережила зґвалтування. Це
She
індійська
herself had experience of being raped.
активістка.
She's an
Вона
Indian
проживала
activist.
в Сполучених Штатах
She
Америки,
lived in the
вчилася в
US. She
університеті,
studied
і
at a
коли вона
university.
приїхала
And when she
описує цей
came,
досвід,
so she
коли вона
describes
приїхала
this
в
experience
Індію
when
до
she
своїх
came back home to
близьких,
India to visit her
ішла
family,
з
and
своїм
she walked with
якимось
her
знайомим, колишнім знайомим чи
acquaintance
другом
or
по
friend
просто по вулиці.
in the street.
Її зловили
She was
якісь
caught
скривдники,
by some
гвалтівники і зґвалтували
perpetrators,
просто
rapists,
тому, що
and they raped
вона
her just
йшла
because
не
she
зі
was
своїм
walking
чоловіком,
not
не
with
зі
her someone
своїм
who was her
там
husband or
людиною, з яким вона перебуває у шлюбі, а з
spouse, but
чужим
she was just walking
чоловіком.
outside with some
І
strange man.
вона написала книгу,
And she wrote a
яка
book,
називається «Про що
the
ми
book that
говоримо,
is
коли ми
titled What
говоримо
We
про
Talk About
зґвалтування».
When We Talk
І
About
вона
Rape.
в цій книзі, ця книга є
And
доступна
this book
для,
is available
для придбання, для
for,
ознайомлення.
you can buy it.
Вона в цій книзі дає
And
перспективу з
in
точки
that book,
зору
she offers her
постраждалої
perspective,
людини, яка вижила,
the perspective
яка
of a
вийшла з
survivor,
цієї проблеми, і
of
вона
someone
була
who
і
managed to
є
get out of that
дуже
territory, of that issue.
такою
And she
сильною відомою активісткою, яка допомагає
is a
іншим
well-known
жінкам
activist
вижити в
now
в
helping
такій
other
проблемі. І
women
вона, власне,
survive through that
працює
issue.
разом з Джудіт Герман. І тут я
And now she
навела
works
кілька
together with
таких
Judith
рекомендацій,
Herman. And here I
які
quote
вона
some of her
звертає
recommendations.
до людей, які допомагають
Recommendations
постраждалим
for
від
helping
зґвалтувань.
people of helping
Дбайте про себе,
professions
це
who work
перше,
with
це
survivors
така
of rape.
універсальна
Take care of yourself.
рекомендація для
Well,
нас.
this is
Перше,
very
маску на
general
себе, потім маску на
recommendation
всіх
for
решту,
us.
на
We
дитину,
put
на інших
oxygen
людей.
mask on
По-перше,
ourselves first, then
маємо
on kids
бути
and other people. So we need
спроможні
to
надавати
to have
допомогу,
this
тому що
capacity to
потім
provide help, because
нас з цього
later
болота будуть
we
інші люди мати витягувати
will
вдвох.
need
Тому
other people to get us, the
тут
two of
завжди
us, of that swamp.
перша рекомендація –
So the
подбайте про
first
себе.
recommendation
Вірте їй,
ever
просто
is
вірте.
always
Це
take care of yourself. Then
знаєте,
believe her,
також
just believe. That's also
універсальна
rather
що і це дуже
a recommendation that can be applied everywhere. And that's a very important recommendation because, as I mentioned already,
люди, котрі допомагають, котрі мають обов'язок допомогти, вони
the people of helping
сумніваються в
professions,
тому,
those
що
who
дійсно так відбулося.
are supposed to
Або
help, they may have doubts about
просять,
whether it
наприклад,
really happened,
почути
or
іншу сторону,
they
чи
may ask the survivor
подивитися
to
там
hear or to
інший
see the
ракурс, ну і так далі.
perspective of the other party, other side, and to look from a different
Рекомендація
angle.
просто вірте.
But no,
Не
here
дайте
the
їй
recommendation
відчути,
is
дуже
just
важливо.
believe her.
Вона
Then hand
експертка в
the
своїй
initiative over to her,
життєвій
delegate this
ситуації.
initiative to
Ви
her. She is
можете,
the expert in her
працюючи разом,
life,
співпрацюючи
working
на
together,
цю
cooperating
ціль, витягти її
for that
з цього болота, ви можете дуже
objective
сильно
to get
опиратися
her
на
out of the
її
swamp, you can very much
спроможності, на
rely
її
on her
експертизу в цьому.
capacity, on her
Вона
expertise.
краще знає. Ми завжди
She knows better.
попереджаємо. Я їй завжди говорю, що зараз я хочу зробити таку і таку
And
практику, або
I always
таку і
tell
таку
her,
вправу,
now
або
I would like to
обговорити
do
те і
this
те. Як ви
activity or
думаєте, чи
exercise, or I
може
would
вам
like
це
to
зробити?
discuss
Я
this and
завжди
that.
її
Do you believe
залучаю
we
до
should do
рішення
that? So I
щодо того
always
чи іншого
engage her,
кроку.
involve her
І
into decision making
це
about next
передає
steps.
їй владу і контроль.
And
Ви
this is
пам'ятаєте про
something
те,
that
що
gives her power
головне
and control. And you
потрібно
remember
допомогти
that the main
відновити владу
thing
і
is
контроль.
that we need to help them to
Коли
recover
вона
power and control.
має якісь
If she has
бажання,
any
хоче щось робити, то треба їй
wish,
дати цей
she wants
простір,
to do
тому що це
something, she needs to
безпечний
have that
стосунок.
space because
Якщо
that's
вона
about
зі
safe
мною
relationship.
може кричати,
If
може
she
бити
can
по
shout
якомусь
with
столі, я
me,
пам'ятаю,
she may
як
bang her
в
fists
мене
against
була
my table.
одна
I
клієнтка,
remember I worked
і
with a client,
один раз вона сказала,
and once
мені
she
дуже
said,
хочеться
I
бити
really
кулаком
want
по
to
столі. Я
bang
кажу,
my
прошу, бий.
fists on
Я
your table. And
була
I
при
invited
тому,
her to
як
do that.
вона била
And I was the witness of her
рукою
banging
по
her
тому
fist
столі. В неї
against
були
that table.
ну, там сильні знаки
She
від цього,
had significant
від цього биття потім.
bruises
Але
then
цей
after she banged it.
досвід дуже
But
добре
that
вплинув на
experience
наш альянс.
had a
Він
very
дуже
good impact on our
добре, ми
alliance.
почали просуватися
Then we were
в
very
терапії, тому
efficient
що
in the
вона відчула
therapy
зі мною
moving further because
значно
with
більше
me,
безпеки, що зі
she could
мною
feel
можна
much safer then.
робити те,
That with
що
me, she could do
вона зараз потребує, і я не
what
буду їй
she
там щось
needed now.
забороняти, чи
That I won't
в якийсь
prohibit
спосіб
anything
там
or in some other
дивуватися від того,
way
що вона робить, чи
be shocked or surprised with
ну,
what she does
якось не так реагувати. Я
or
витримую
respond
те,
in some
як вона себе проявляє. Це
inadequate
дуже
way. No,
важливо,
I
щоб
can stand that. I
ця
can
людина
tolerate that. And
розуміла,
that's so
що
important
вона тут
that
може бути
that
собою.
person
Вона не мусить
understands that
створювати
she
ці
can be
фасади,
herself
вона
there.
не
She does
мусить
not need her facade.
бути такою,
She does
щоб
not need to be
сподобатися там комусь. Ви безпечна
liked
людина. З вами можна
because you
плакати,
are a
з вами
safe person for her.
можна... І коли вона
With
це
you, she can
проходить,
cry and so on and
вона
so forth. So,
позбавляється
and
сорому.
when she
А
has that
нам
experience,
важливо
she gets rid of her shame.
оцей от досвід, коли мені
And
вже не
that's important,
соромно, я вже
this
можу
experience, when
говорити про
I'm
те,
no
що
longer ashamed. I can now
минулого
speak
тижня була
about that.
жінка,
Last week, I worked with a woman
яка сказала на
who
консультації,
said
в неї
at a
дуже
session
ну, сильне насильство, і вона каже,
she also experienced a
після
violent attack. And
консультації вона мені
after that
сказала,
session, she told
я
me,
от зараз, як думаю про те, про що
now
я сьогодні
that I think
розказувала,
about what I've told you today,
я собі кажу,
I tell
Боже,
myself,
як ти до цього
God,
дійшла, як
how
ти
come it happens to you? How come
дозволила себе так.
that you
Тобто це так, таке
allowed that?
глибоке страждання від того,
I
що
mean, this is
вона
about very deep
усвідомлює, що з
suffering because
нею
she
насправді
finally
відбувається. І
realizes, becomes aware of
це
what's going on,
страждання,
what's
коли є
happening to
друга
her. And
людина,
this
котра
suffering
співчуває,
in the
котра
situation where there is the
просто
second
є
person,
поряд,
second individual who's
воно
compassionate
таке
with
зцілююче,
her,
воно
that's very
це
wholesome
власне
and healing.
проговорювання тої травми,
And
про яку я говорила
talking
тоді до тебе.
about this is about this kind of Judith Herman's recommendations regarding talking about the trauma. Next recommendation, ask her what she wants. At the beginning of each session, I always ask the client if they would like to speak about something particular. Otherwise, we move further according to our therapy plan, or otherwise we may have a short discussion on that, on what they suggest, because then further on it may distract us from our work. Steps to address the current problems. These are adaptive strategies based on Burgess and Holmstrom. What could be helpful there? We are guided by some specific steps to address particular issues. And those could be very straightforward, simple steps, like having a puppy, taking in a puppy, or a large dog, for example. I don't remember the name of that breed of the dog that my client got, but according to the client, that dog is going to protect her. Or bought some protection device. Or now in our shelter, we do self-defense sessions. So she starts attending those sessions or training. So she undertakes some steps that help her to address the issue, to start controlling something in her life. Or wrote an email to the employer asking them to increase their salary, whatever. So this is about some steps where I see recovery of this power and control. And that's cool. When I see that, I say, cool, you are cool. You have already started undertaking these important steps. You are recovering your power and control, and you manage your life. I just comment on what she's actually doing. I give her some feedback, and she realizes that this is the road that is supposed to take her out of that issue. Supported by warm and emotionally significant people. Social support, that's one of key clusters that we work on. We have several meetings where we focus on social support, several sessions. So this is about the people that they have in life or used to have. And we think about how it would be possible to develop contact with those people, or recover, restore that contact, or maybe look for other people if there is no contact. Because now, for example, we have a lot of internally displaced people in our city, and now we don't have a lot of people around with whom they could meet and talk and have some coffee. And so we think about how we could help them develop new links, connections, how to socialize them in that new space, how they could look for those points of reliance, helping others. This is very helpful. This approach that is the basis for peer-to-peer approach, for example, where someone with the same problem that has been addressed already helps other people where they have not yet resolved those issues. We had mutual support group for women who are divorced or who are in the process of divorce. And there we invited various women, our clients, for example, those who have already done that, who were already divorced, or if they are still planning or thinking whether they should divorce or not, or those who are at various other phases of this divorce process, and they communicate well. They share their experience. They share funny stories during those meetings. They share some life hacks about that you need to submit an application in this or that form. So they have that important experience, important for all, and they share that experience, and that works well. This may be Alcoholics Anonymous groups or groups of people who are relatives of those Alcoholics Anonymous. So these are groups where they have the same problem, same issue, and people help each other. And the mission of survivor missions, this is about those who manage to survive, who manage to grow post-traumatically. They have the need to help others, and in this way, they also help themselves significantly because they get this social capital, social approval, and then people who do that, they respect them a lot and they thank them, and that's what we need to overcome isolation as a precursor of deeper problems. So this is about the shame that I mentioned already, filling one's capacity, and the appearance emergence of a goal in one's life when we start thinking about our future life.
And these are very basic conditions we use. It's our relations with this person. She knows that I can be trusted. She knows that she can share with me everything that is painful for her. For example, today I've received a text message from one of my clients, and she writes to me that she returned to her former ex-husband with the children. He beat her, and he threatens that if she goes to the police, she went missing from the shelter for a few days, and she says, "Yeah, I'm really ashamed. I don't know what to do. I want to run away, but I understand that I will not be accepted back to the shelter because I have violated a lot of rules." And so she tells me about that. She doesn't tell that to the administrator of the shelter. She doesn't speak to her relatives that she has, but she wants to discuss that with me. And I give her this space. I tell her, yeah, you can come, we'll talk about what's happened, and we'll think about what's next. We have certain framework, certain rules that cannot be violated, but it doesn't mean that we cannot speak about that, or that we cannot help her find a way out of that situation that is created by her actions. And yeah, she actually manages the interaction, so we are witnesses and consultants, just being close and helping, and not like managing their lives. And that safety is the main focus at the first stage when we provide help. Yeah. So one more. Yeah, because we have just a few things here which I forgot to mention. about so-called bilateral stimulation. What we can do, I will move the slide to the links to the records of the webinars. So-called the therapy of MDR, where when we make well, consequently right and left part of our body are stimulated. So that's the kind of first aid for traumatic experience. And if you don't have, for example, some special training of the ground in this area, or if you don't know how it's used, it is, well, you don't have to know it, but some kinds of bilateral stimulation of right and left parts of the body is something that you can use, because that's a therapy based on evolutional mechanisms, and it is very simple. It may be helpful, for instance, to take any actions that activate our right and left hemispheres of the brain, and respectively the opposite halves of the body, and that's the way we help the body integrate the trauma. What can that be? That can be like, clapping right or left hand on your legs, for example. It can be walking, because right and left leg are activated one after another. They take turns. Then it can be the butterfly, the classic exercise, which allows you to, well, move different parts of your body. So any bilateral stimulation of the right and the left parts of your body is helpful. It can be, I don't know, drumming on. I'm sorry. I have some distracting noises. What else can that be? Even well, knitting, for example, when you well, use the right and left hand to produce this fabric, you are knitting something, and that helps you, that soothes you. So this way we start to, well, after you practice it, you start using it automatically. You start walking when you're under stress, or even running, and this needs to be supported. Embracing oneself is very good when a person gives herself a feeling of contact with themselves, accepting themselves. That's also important. Of helping to cope with the trauma. That's probably it. That's all I have time to tell you about today. I saw that there were questions in the chat. Let me check those. Yeah, while you're checking, Marta, you can see the questions in the chat, but I also have a few questions. And while we have everyone here, I wanted to show an important thing about certificates and testing. So there are many questions. I would like to share this slide that you showed, Marta. It had a link to our website with all the information about the webinars. I will show it to you once again, this link. So here is our site, and here is the page with the records of the webinars. It's available in 3 languages, English, Ukrainian, and Russian. It has records of the video. You can choose the language there as well. Last time at the webinar, I showed you how to choose the language. And below there are presentations by Marta in several languages. Maybe later we will have also the presentations in Bosnian and Albanian, but I cannot guarantee that yet. So far we have presentation only in the 3 languages and the Georgian language. And today, by the end of the day, we're going to post the record of the 3rd webinar and we'll publish the presentation. And talking about testing, here you also have testing that you can take until the 31st of January and receive a certificate. Here you can press this button. It's available in all the languages. So you press this button and you are referred to this page. That's our testing. It's now available in 3 languages: English, Ukrainian, and Russian. I hope it's not a problem. I'm not sure whether we will be able to translate this test into other languages. We will try, but I cannot guarantee it yet. And so there is this testing. It has questions, and we even gave you a link to the webinar where we discussed this thing. We encourage you to look through this testing once again, analyze all the information, because this testing was something we did not to sort of check or really your knowledge. We just made it to once again focus on the important key points which we wanted to highlight on this webinars. So the questions are made so that while answering them, you recalled once again the key words from this webinar. And after you make all the selections, then it has 10 questions, and then it asks for your name and surname you want in your certificate and the email you'd like to get your certificate on. And when you press this button, the button send, it will show you this page that your answer has been submitted. So we encourage you to click this button, check the result, and then you'll see the correct answers to the questions. So you will have this page with the questions open once again, and with your answers too, and it will indicate what answer is correct and why. So that's the most important part of the test. Review once again the correct answers to the questions, because once again we are trying to fix in your mind the solid, the most important information from these webinars. So take the test, check the correct answers, and to tell you the secret, we are going to give the certificate to everyone taking the test, regardless of how correct your answers are. So the certificate will not depend on the success of your testing. So we will send the certificates to all who take part in the testing. I will check whether you watched the webinars. I can check the list of participants. Yeah, so I will try to see which participants have actually checked the webinars, who are present, who got tested, and they will get the priority certificates. But actually the certificates the certificates will be given to all the people who take the testing, but I encourage you also to check the correct answers, because that's the most important from all the course. Yes, so those correct answers to 10 questions. Now I am closing this one, And there is a question about the material. Marta, I have a couple of questions to you, and I would like you to answer those. And then we'll be speaking about the questions from the chat and from the section of Q&A. The first question is, please name the steps of working with the survivors. So today you were speaking about psychological part mostly, but how, in your opinion, the perfect way of well, dealing with the violence works? So, for example, we have the survivor of a violence. She came to us and she's willing, she's ready, she's accepting everything we suggest. So what steps would you advise us to do, and what is the final sort of destination point with regard to the survivor and the perpetrator, briefly? And the second question is related to the first one. Should we or can we try to reconciliate the survivor and the perpetrator? We know about the honeymoon period when the survivor may want to reconciliate themselves, but quite often we see in practice that the police, when they come to a violence call, they try to reconciliate the couple, or the family tries to do that. Do you think that's a good strategy, or is it acceptable at all? Thank you very much, Victoria. Let me start with the second one because it's very simple. I've already said about that during the previous webinars that any reconciliation is forbidden even by the norms of the Istanbul Convention. Istanbul Convention demands that the states signatories make the representatives of the state avoid trying to reconcile the parties. Reconciliation is the business of two persons. The state must not intervene in this. It's not a mediator. That this business is not mediable, and in such cases and reconciliations are forbidden by the Istanbul Convention. So the practice of providing aid also forbids that. And returning to your first question, what would be the perfect protocol for helping this survivor? Well, our protocol is to follow two main directions of working. So the first is security. And while there is no security, we cannot work with any problems of traumatic nature. We can only work to strengthen to increase the capacity, to empower the survivor to analyze the way to security. And very helpful here are shelters. If we don't have shelters, we need to think about where she can find a safe place to get secured from the perpetrator. In our country, we have the judicial orders that force the perpetrators to keep away. But I understand that in some countries, such things don't exist. So we need to think about the safety plan, and we need to come up with the steps to increase the security of the survivor of violence. And then we consider her needs. We follow her requests. We ask, what problem do you have right now? And we start resolving this problem. If she agrees to that, if it's really her problem, then we start doing something about that. These can be social problems. It's very important in this process to ensure security and increase her resources, to increase her social resources, to check whether it is possible to increase the economic or financial resource, and I've already spoken about that at the first seminar. But again, the more resources she has, the more capacity she will then have to return the control and the power to herself. And that's one of the most important goals which we follow. It's very basic, yes, it's very general, but it doesn't matter whether we are psychologists or therapists or some other supporters. Our task is to increase her security and give her back the control and the power. And we can use different sorts for that. We all have our own methods or tools which we use to get that lady out of the swamp, and we use what we have. I don't know really if we can speak about this model, then for example, you would you should rather go to the police and get a divorce, and I don't know, some specific recommendations. We are speaking about the opportunities. We say that if you want to go to the police, then you can use, for example, free lawyers provided by the state. If there is such a service, for example, we have free legal aid provided in our country, and the survivors of violence can use it.
It may be services of social institutions, social services for youth. So we offer a range of opportunities that she may use, but she may also say, now for me it is too stressful, too hard, I cannot do this or that, and we just respect her choice. We understand that sooner or later it could really speed up her recovery from that situation. And I often say that, I think that if you did go to police, I believe it would speed up the resolution, but you are the expert of your life. You assess your safety situation, you know if it is safe or not. So I always respect her choice. Sometimes I do want to shake her and make her do something, but I try to abstain from that. I have my own individual therapy, interventions, supervisions, and I don't do that. So my answer is this. It's not an answer as such, but now we don't push her along those phases. If she wants to go there, we accompany her, but we do not push her. Thank you, Marta, so much. And that's important to understand that we need to offer a choice to the survivor and indicate the ways how the events may develop and accompany her on the way. And being a human rights activist, I would like to add to what Marta has said, that in the perfect world, if everything were perfect, the police, as a representative of the state, as an institution that defends our rights, should be the first trusted destination where the survivors would go without anticipating any danger or obstacles or difficulties. But the world is not perfect, obviously, and now we cannot really, neither us nor survivors, perceive the police as such, even though it is something that we need to aspire to. This is what we need to request from our states. States need to undertake responsibility for violence against, for cases of violence against women, and the state needs to undertake steps to mitigate that, to prevent that. And the state needs to introduce the framework and create the field where the survivor, without any barriers, would be in the position to come to court, to the police, to get some protection there. This is about the perfect world, of course. The police needs to prioritize these cases and respond and be so available that the women should not be afraid to call the police and complain about the perpetrator. This is what we need to request from the police and from the state. Several more questions. Our colleague Hanna Dolbach, she has written a lot about her experience of working with shelters as responding to violence. During COVID, they established shelters for women suffering survivors of violence and women from vulnerable groups. So you can look through her comments. This is valuable experience. And Anna asks us whether at centers of assistance and support, whether we should treat all clients as such that have experienced violence. Are there general recommendations on how to organize the space that would be safe for those who survived violence? And if provision of services by female advisors will be helpful there. So maybe, Marta, you have already addressed that, but maybe you can look through that comment and add something to that. And while you are doing that, I would like to mention that Anna Dolbach represents Eurasian Harm Reduction Association, and they have produced some videos. There is a link to YouTube. Please look through that. That's helpful. And also, they have prepared a series of webinars on violence in the time of war. And we will definitely send you links to those webinars from our partners. They are very helpful, those information materials. And on our webpage for our webinar, we will also add links to webinars of our partners. So Marta, would you like to add or comment on something? Thank you, Hanna, for your questions. That is very reasonable that you ask about how to take that experience into account. So we do not separate or delineate approaches or based on whether the woman had experience of violence or not. Now we have 2 shelters for those who for survivors of violence and 5 shelters for internally displaced people in general. And all the approaches are the same. Because this is about dealing with people in trauma, people who have had some traumatizing experience. And there are some specific approaches if there are additional vulnerabilities. Like, for example, some motor or movement restrictions or some other health problems. There we may apply some specific approach. However, if we speak about survivors of domestic violence or of violence in general, in our shelters, especially for women who suffered violence, there we have additional conditions to ensure safety. In those shelters, in those particular, in other shelters you can do that, but in those shelters you cannot bring visitors, you cannot disclose the address of those shelters. So there we undertake some steps to ensure security. We do something additionally there. If someone wants to leave the shelter for more than 24 hours, you need to coordinate that because it may happen that the perpetrator kidnaps the person. In other shelters, we do not apply that, but here we are very cautious because if a woman disappears, we need to undertake some steps to organize her search for her. So this is rather about safety,
комунікації
about
можливій комунікації
communication,
з кривдником.
possible
І
communication
ми
with
тут
the
дуже
perpetrator, and
уважно до
there
цього
we are
ставимося. І
very
також в
attentive.
цих
And
притулках
also in
ми
those
маємо додаткову
shelters, we have
умову, що
additional
категорично
condition where
заборонено
it is
насильницька
absolutely prohibited
поведінка в цих
to
притулках.
behave
Вплоть до того, що
violently there.
ми
Even
виселяємо, у нас було кілька випадків, коли
we
ми виселили
expel
постраждалих від насильства, яке
some
почала
survivors
вчиняти
of
саме
violence when
насильство.
they
Ми їм
themselves start
допомогли
committing
зняти
violence.
квартиру,
We help
але
that woman to find
це є
an
місце
apartment to
безпеки,
rent,
це є
but
місце
that place
без
needs to be a
насильства
safe
і
place,
застосовувати насильство
with
навіть
zero
якщо ти
tolerance to
сама
violence.
постраждала від
And
насильства.
applying violence,
Тут
even if
категорично
you
заборонено. Я не знаю,
yourself
чи це
are
повний перелік,
survivor
але
of
те, що
violence,
приходить
this is prohibited.
мені зараз
I'm not sure if it is
на
the
розум,
full
то я
list, but
про
this is
це
what
говорю.
has occurred to me.
Дуже цікаво, я подивлюся обов'язково
Yes, that's
ваші
interesting,
ролики
and definitely I will
і
look through
вебінари.
your videos and
Дякую за
webinars,
те, що
and
ділитеся
thank you
цими
for
посиланнями.
sharing
Яке ще
these
було питання про
links.
що ще?
And
Зараз
there was another
є
question,
тут
right?
ще питання. Тут єдине, що я хотіла ще
Yes,
додати
I will
з того,
address
що в нас
more
Ганна
questions to
написала
you.
в
Let
чат.
me
Якщо
add to
якщо
what
раптом ви
Hannah
працюєте з жінками,
describes
ви
in the
розумієте,
chat,
що
that
жінці
if you
потрібна
work with women and you understand that a woman
ще
needs
додаткова допомога, наприклад,
some additional
вже
assistance,
якщо
for
вона вживає
example,
психоактивні
if
речовини, то є
she
цілий
uses
спектр
psychoactive
послуг
substances,
в
then
кожній
there is a
країні,
range
але
of
в Україні,
services
зокрема,
in each of the
для
countries, but
людей, що
in
вживають
particular in
наркотики,
Ukraine,
тобто
for
там
those people
має
who
бути допомога
use
комплексна,
drugs.
крім
So it
психологічної,
needs
там
to be
правової допомоги,
comprehensive
дуже важливо вчасно задіювати
assistance,
і
not
послуги
only
зменшення
psychological
шкоди,
and
ті
legal
медичні
aid, but
послуги,
also
чи можливо
it is
там
important to
тестування
use harm
на ВІЛ, на
reduction
гепатити,
services
дуже
or
часто
maybe
люди,
HIV,
які попереджають
hepatitis
сексуальне
testing,
насильство,
because often
є в
women who
ризику, тому
experience
варто теж
sexual violence, they are the high risk
проводити
group.
такі медичні
So
втручання. Тому
some
пам'ятайте, що
medical
важливо
healthcare
комплексно надавати
interventions
допомогу і
are
важливо шукати
also
партнерства
justified. So
в
it's
країні, де
important
ви
to
працюєте,
think about
і
comprehensive
забезпечити
approach, and you
постраждалим
need to look
максимально
for
широким
partnership
колом сервісів, які
opportunities
вона
in
потребує.
the country where you
Ще є
work
питання
and
від
to provide
Мирослави.
as
Якщо
extensive range
людина
of
знаходиться в
services as
стосунках
they need.
і
Another question from
в
Miroslava.
насильницьких стосунках,
If
але не
somebody
усвідомлює і не
is in
приймає
a
реальність і
violent
потребу цієї
relationship
ситуації,
but
не
is not
звертається за
aware of
допомогою,
that, doesn't
але
realize that
звернулась
the situation is
до
real and
нас з
doesn't come
іншим
for help,
наміром,
but she may come to
то
us
чи
with another
як
issue.
ненасильницьки і
So
емпатично привести її до розуміння
how
реальності, в тому,
would
що
it
вона
be
перебуває в
possible
насильстві?
to empathically help her become aware
Це
of
питання,
her
також дякую,
situation, that she
Мирослава,
is in
за
a
це питання.
situation of
І
violence?
тут було ще
Thank you, Miroslava,
запитання
for
від
that
Ганни
question. And there
інше
was
про
also a
те,
question
що
from Ganna,
жінки
another
часто
question about
дуже
that women
таке
often,
співзвучне мені з питанням Мирослави,
oh, and
що жінки часто
it seems
приходять з
similar to
іншими
what Miroslava is
запитами,
asking about, that
з
women often
неозвученими
come with
запитами про
other
насильство.
issues
І
without speaking
тут
about violence. So
моя відповідь,
here
моя якби
my response would be the
дія чи
following.
моя програма,
How I
відтоді
would
я
act,
починаю з нею працювати,
what I
це
anticipate for her.
встановлення безпечного стосунку
This is above
і
all establishing
довіри.
safe
І тоді,
relationship
коли вона
and
буде
trust. And then
відчувати
when she feels
власне
her
безпеку, тоді ми зможемо
safety,
говорити і про
she
насильство, і
feels
проблеми
she's safe, then we can speak about
різного
violence
плану, і про
and
сором, і
about
про
various issues
вину, і про всі ці
like
проблеми, про
shame
які ми
and
сьогодні говоримо.
guilt
Тобто,
and all the
коли я не
problems that
маю,
we
коли
have
я маю такий,
discussed.
знаєте,
So where I
вершечок айсбергу, з яким вона прийшла, вона там каже
see
про
only the
самооцінку, чи
tip
про
of
ще
the
якісь там
iceberg when she comes
в мене
with, for
проблеми
example,
контакту з
low
дітьми, чи
self-esteem
щось
or
таке, ми
problems
починаємо
dealing with her
говорити про це.
children and so on and so forth,
І
we
ми
start speaking
налагоджуємо
about that.
стосунок,
And then we
вона відчуває
develop this
безпеку,
relationship.
вона,
She feels safe.
якщо я, наприклад, можливо,
And
Мирослава
if
мала на увазі це, я
well,
зараз
maybe
фантазую,
this is what
якщо я
Miroslava
бачу, що
means,
вона
but I'm
страждає,
fantasizing. So if I
вона
see that
ходить
she's
з синцями,
suffering,
але вона не
that she
признається
is
про те, що
bruised,
вона
but
має
she
цю
does
проблему,
not
вона каже, що вона там впала
admit
зі
that she
сходів чи
has
ще
that
щось.
problem, she says that she fell down the
Тут
stairs or whatever,
схема
then the
контакту для
approach
мене така,
to
що
contact would be the
я кажу
following,
про
as
те,
I
що
see it.
мені здається,
I
що відбувається
tell
те,
her
що не
that
має
it seems to
відбуватися.
me that something
І
that shouldn't
якщо я
happen
можу
happens.
допомогти
And if I can help you, if so you believe that I can be helpful, just tell me. But if you believe that I cannot be helpful, then keep in mind that you can come to me just for coffee, to have coffee, if it is my neighbor, for example, or we can sit together and keep silent if you need that. So I suggest some options how I can be with her, how I can be a point of reliance for her. These people really need that. Like children need at least one healthy adult, significant adult in their life to grow up. In the same way, people in trauma, they also need to have someone next to them, someone they can rely on. And this must not necessarily be people who help them resolve the problems or who start involving the entire system, like the police, psychotherapists, legal aid, free legal aid, and so on and so forth. Even though we often see these situations where somebody calls me and says, my neighbor or my friend has been suffering for many years. This is her phone. Please call her, save her. And then we start working with the woman who addressed us, not working with her, but just discussing, talking to her in order to enhance her capacity to help the other. I see another question from Ola about the book. Ola, all the presentations are made available, so you can check the name of the book. I don't know which book you mean there in your question, but all the photos, all the names, titles will be available from those presentations. If it is violence if a woman cannot interact with men as friends. Well, do I get your question right, Inna? If a woman communicates with men, with some other men, with friends, male friends, and the husband prohibits her to do that. Well, if that's the case, always, if there is a question, if you have doubts about if some situation is that of violence or not, we apply a Jerzy Malibruda model, which we discussed at the first seminar. We check if this prohibition incurs some consequences. To what extent this prohibition does harm to this woman. If this woman, well, again, I'm fantasizing, if the woman stops earning money, for example, this was a man who gave her some jobs, or if she is emotionally impacted, or when he prohibits her to deal with that man, he also beats her. So if some damage, harm is done, then it may be violence. This is about conscious actions. If such prohibition happens, this is violation of human rights. You have the right to communicate with whoever. That's your decision, and you are the master of your life, and you can make your decisions, who you talk to, who you don't, and nobody but you can make that decision for you. So if damage is inflicted as a result of that prohibition, then we can say that interaction, that situation is a situation of violence, yes.
доручення на звернення до суду в
The
інтересах клієнтки.
free legal
На обмежений
aid
період після
system
першої консультації клієнт
passes
повертає
a case
заключення
over to
уточнення
the
змісту
lawyer to
цих
issue
фактів,
the restrictive warrant, and
належного обґрунтування системного насильства
then the client avoids
строку дії кривдника.
contact.
Наразі вже живе окремо, його контакт по телефону
Now the
та кредитних
perpetrator
рахунках
lives
заблоковано, але він є
separately.
свідком. Як допустимо
So
діяти в такому
how
випадку
to act
адвокату
in this
для
situation?
оформлення
What should the
документів? Це
lawyer do in order to
досить
register the
часта
documents?
проблема. Ми говорили про
Well,
неї
you
також
describe
під час
a frequent
першого
issue, and this is
нашого
something
семінару,
that we
про те,
discussed
що
during
дуже
our first
часто
seminar,
клієнтки
that
виходять з
often
процесу,
clients,
не
they step
хочуть
out of the
продовжувати,
process. They don't want to
тому
continue,
що її дуже часто
go
я
on,
чую
because
таке: я не
often
хочу,
I
щоб він
hear
сидів
that,
в тюрмі,
like,
я
I
не
don't want
хочу,
him
щоб
to
він був
go to
покараний,
prison.
хочу
I don't
тільки,
want
щоб
to
зупинилося насильство. І ми
punish
бачимо
him.
тут
I just
таку
want that
в
violence to
цьому
stop.
запитанні,
And they, in that
бачимо таку
question, we
вже
see a
ситуацію, що вона
certain, we see
дистанціювалася, вона
this
живе
situation
окремо,
where they,
в неї
where
вже
she
налагоджується життя,
is
і їй вже не
separated, she lives
цікаво там
separately, she has a new life, and she's
продовжувати
no
оці
longer interested
травматичні часто
with those, to
контакти
continue
з
with those traumatic
кривдником. І
contacts
тут
in the
ми маємо
context of
проблему, власне,
litigation
про яку говорить
against the
адвокат, котрий,
perpetrator. And then this problem
адвокат
may arise,
зайшов у
as you
справу, він
described, that
має
the lawyer
метою
starts the
закінчити цю
case
справу,
and wants
а
to complete it, of
постраждала
course, but the
виходить з цієї
survivor
справи.
steps out.
І тут також різні
And
стратегії можуть бути
there
задіяні.
also
Наша
various
адвокатка дуже
strategies may
часто,
be
у нас наші адвокатки, вони
applied.
мають таку
Our
ситуацію,
lawyers,
просто
often when they encounter such a
розповідають про
situation, they
перспективу.
just
Тобто, якщо
speak
ви
about
будете мати
prospects.
цей
Like if you
рішення,
have
то
this
воно вам
barring
дає наступні
order,
там
for example,
переваги.
that
Якщо
decision
ви
or court
виходите зараз
ruling,
з
you
цього
will have
рішення, то
these
на наступний
advantages.
раз,
If you
коли
step out
буде відбуватися
next
насильство,
time when
будуть такі і такі наслідки.
violence
Ми
happens, you will
покладаємося на
have the
її
following
рішення.
consequences.
Може
But
це рішення
anyway, we
нам
rely on her
не
decision.
подобатися. Може
It's
це рішення
okay. We don't
бути
like
взагалі
her
там з нашої
decision.
точки
Maybe
зору
this decision, we
просто
believe that it
якимось
is
неможливим. Але
like
ми це
somehow
маємо побажати. Це її життя, і
crazy,
вона,
impossible, but this
я
is what we
розумію, що
need to
це
respect. That's
може
her life. And
впливати
I
на
understand that
наслідки
it may
в
impact the
нашому роботі на місці, на
consequences
показники.
for
Держава
us,
витрачає
our
кошти на те, щоб
indicators, because the
оплачувати
state
адвоката.
invests money
Але,
into free
на
legal
жаль,
aid.
часто
But
так буває, що
unfortunately, it
постраждалі
often
виходять з
happens
процесу,
that
і ми маємо це
survivors step
поважати.
out of the
Ми
process,
можемо
and we
робити
need
якісь
to
кроки для
respect
того,
that.
щоб
We may
роз'яснювати
undertake some steps to explain the
перспективу,
situation
але
and
вона
prospects,
має
but
останнє слово. Какие
the final
отношения
say is
могут
hers.
быть с бывшим партнером, который прошел
And
программу
a
для
question:
агрессоров
what
с
relations can be with a partner
неясним
who have
результатом?
taken a
Ну,
perpetrator's program with an
можуть бути
unclear
отношення
result?
з неясним
Well,
результатом.
there
Навіть
can
якщо
be
він з успішним
relationships with
результатом пройшов цю програму,
unclear result too. Even if the program was successful and he completed it well, the result may be still unclear. So there is always a danger that
ця людина
under
піде
stress,
по
this
дуже
person will follow
знайомій для нього
his
моделі поведінки, яка
that very
дає
well-known
йому
model of
відчуття
behavior, something that gives him the
значимості його его, дає йому контроль,
familiar
і
path
це
that gives him
завжди
the
такий
feeling of
ризик,
power and
який
control
є в
that
цих
supports his
стосунках. І
ego, and that's a
важливо
risk
обговорювати це,
for
якщо
such
ми там
relationships. It needs to be
перейшли
discussed.
на такі здорові комунікації, важливо
If
говорити
they
про
have switched to healthy
пропущі. Я боюся,
communications,
що
this needs
незважаючи
to
на
be
те, що він
discussed.
пройшов там
Like,
цю
I'm afraid that
програму,
despite
це
you
може
haven't taken this
повертися.
program, it
Ну,
may
тобто, чим
happen again.
більше ми можемо говорити про свої
So the more we can speak
емоції,
about
відчуття
our
і
emotions, feelings,
якісь
and so
передчуття, можливо, тим є
well,
більше безпеки
maybe
в стосунках.
expectations, the more safety or security there will be in the
Дякуємо, пані Марта.
relationships.
Я
Thank
думаю,
you
що
very
це
much,
було, напевно,
Marta.
останнє наше
I think it was the last question
питання. Ми
we
так перетримали. Я дуже
took.
хочу подякувати пані Марті за те, що вона
Thank
з
you very
нами
much,
була
Marta,
весь
for
цей тиждень,
spending these
провела нам
3
3
days with
чудові
us,
вебінари з
for
цінною
3 beautiful
інформацією. У
webinars.
нас пропадало світло, у нас не було зв'язку, у
We
нас були
lost power
проблеми з
supply, we
інтернетом.
lost internet
Деякі
connection.
вебінари у нас проходили під
Some
час повітряної
webinars
тривоги і
took
ракетних
place under
атаки.
rocket
Тому
attacks.
ми
and
дійсно
air
героїчно
raid
провели ці
alarms.
вебінари в таких
Yeah,
умовах,
we
коли зараз
were
Україна
quite heroic
перебуває.
conducting these
Вам
webinars,
Бог поміг, щоб
and
ця
I
інформація цінна
think
дійсно
it was
розійшлася
God who helped
широко
us to share this
серед наших
information
партнерів в
among our
регіоні.
partners in the region.
Тому
So
дуже
I thank you very
дякую
much
всім
for your efforts and for
нас,
participation,
хто
for
слухав
attendance,
інформацію.
for those who
Ми також
listen to
заохочуємо
us.
ділитися цією
And we
інформацією.
encourage you to share this
Ще раз
information
дякуємо,
as
пані Марта,
well.
за те, що
And
вона
thank you
змогла
very
до нас
much,
долучитися,
Marta, for
поділитися
joining
досвідом.
us and sharing your
Я дуже
experience.
дякую також
Thank you
всім за
too.
цікавлення.
Thanks
Я дуже
to everyone who was
завжди
really
рада
interested. I
відвідувати
am
заходи,
really
тому що
happy
я
to
хочу, щоб
attend
діти
such
були
meetings
в сфері
because I want
безпеки
the world to be a
більше
more secure place.
співчуття і
To
чутливості
people
до
show more
болі
sympathy,
жінок, і
especially to
дітей,
the
і
pain of women and
постраждалих
children,
від
everyone affected
насильства.
by the
Я
violence.
бажаю вам, щоб в
And I
вашому
wish you all
житті було багато
that
світла,
in your
багато
lives you
тепла у всіх і багато безпеки
have
у
a lot of
всіх
light
можливих
and
проявах
warmth
цих
and
безпеки,
security in
тепла
all
і
possible
світла.
ways.
Дякую вам.
Thank you very much.
Дякуємо дуже. Всі матеріали,
Thanks a
всі
lot.
записи
All
будуть
the
теж
materials
надіслані
and
вам на
records
пошту.
will be
Відвідуйте,
sent to your
читайте, там
emails.
багато
Please
інформації,
visit our
багато
website. We
цікавих
have a lot of
матеріалів.
information, a
Тому
lot of interesting
дякуємо, що до
materials.
нас
So thank you for
приєдналися.
joining us.
До нових зустрічей.
See you next time.